The glass door shattered the silence before it hit the wall. Every head in the boardroom turned as Victoria Hale stood, her diamond-studded watch catching the merciless afternoon light. "You're fired," she said, her voice cold enough to frost the floor-to-ceiling windows. The young manager's face drained of color. 20 executives held their breath. But then, impossibly, a voice cut through the tension. A janitor's voice, calm and unwavering. "With all due respect, ma'am, crushing someone's spirit won't fix the problem." The room stopped breathing. No one had ever challenged Victoria Hale. No one dared. Until today. Welcome to a story about power, fear, and the courage to be human. If you stay with me until the end, you'll witness how one honest man changed everything. Please hit that like button and comment with your city name. I want to see how far this story travels across the world. The Hale Industries Tower pierced the Manhattan skyline like a chrome needle. 73 floors of glass and steel that reflected everything but revealed nothing. From her corner office on the top floor, Victoria Hale surveyed the city below with the detachment of a chess master studying pieces on a board. She didn't see people down there. She saw patterns, predictabilities, variables to be controlled. At 42, Victoria had built an empire that made grown men stammer and seasoned executives check their presentations 3 times before entering her orbit. Her wealth was estimated at $4.3 billion, but numbers were just numbers. What mattered was the power. The way a room shifted when she entered, the way conversations died mid-sentence, the way even her praise felt like a warning. She wore her trademark charcoal suits like armor, her dark hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch her face taut, sharpening already sharp features. Her eyes were the color of winter ice, and they missed nothing. A wrinkle in someone's shirt. A half-second hesitation before answering. The slight tremor in a voice that betrayed uncertainty. Victoria collected weaknesses the way other people collected art. This particular Thursday morning had started like any other. She'd arrived at 5:47 a.m., always before sunrise, always before anyone else. She'd reviewed 3 acquisition proposals, rejected 2, and torn apart the third with red ink precision that would make the M&A team rebuild it from scratch. By 8:30 a.m., she'd attended a virtual meeting with her Tokyo office, where her fluent Japanese had surprised a new partner who'd hoped the language barrier might buy him some grace. It hadn't. At 9:15 a.m., she'd passed through the executive floor with her assistant Marcus scrambling to keep pace, his tablet glowing with her schedule. Employees flattened themselves against walls as she passed, eyes down, conversations dying like candles snuffed out. The fear was palpable, thick enough to taste. And Victoria? She breathed it in like oxygen. "The quarterly review meeting is in 15 minutes, Ms. Hale," Marcus said, his voice carefully neutral. He'd learned years ago not to inflect emotion around her. She interpreted enthusiasm as manipulation and concern as weakness. "I'm aware, Marcus." Victoria's heels clicked against the marble floor like a countdown timer. "Is everyone prepared?" The slight pause before his answer told her everything. "Mr. Chen from Technical Development requested 5 more minutes to—" "No. Ms. Hale, the presentation system had a malfunction this morning, and—" Victoria stopped so abruptly that Marcus nearly collided with her. She turned, and he took an involuntary step backward. "Marcus, what do we pay the Technical Development Department to do?" "To ensure systems function properly, ma'am. And if they can't manage that single responsibility, what does that tell us about their competence?" Marcus swallowed. "That it's inadequate." "Precisely." Victoria resumed walking, her stride unbroken. "The meeting starts at 9:30. If Mr. Chen isn't ready, he can explain why in front of everyone." The conference room on the 71st floor was a masterpiece of intimidation design. Victoria had ensured that personally. The table was black glass, polished to a mirror shine that reflected every uncomfortable facial expression. The chairs were deliberately just slightly too low, putting everyone at a psychological disadvantage when Victoria remained standing, which she often did. The windows behind her position flooded the room with glaring light, forcing people to squint when looking at her, while she remained a silhouette, more shadow than human. 20 department heads filed in with the solemn precision of soldiers heading to battle. They carried tablets, folders, carefully prepared speeches they'd rehearsed in mirrors and in their cars and in the elevator on the way up. They wore their best suits, their most confident expressions, their most bulletproof presentations. None of it would be enough. It never was. David Chen, head of technical development, took his seat near the middle of the table, his face already glazed with a thin sheen of sweat despite the aggressive air conditioning. He was 34, brilliant with code and systems architecture, but terrified of public speaking, especially in front of Victoria Hale. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged his notes. Victoria entered at 9:30 exactly, not 1 second before or after. The room fell silent so completely that the hum of the ventilation system became suddenly, oppressively audible. She didn't greet anyone. She sat, folded her hands on the table, and simply looked at David Chen. "Mr. Chen, you have the floor." David stood, his chair scraping loudly in the silence. He cleared his throat, clicked his remote. The screen behind him remained dark. He clicked again. Nothing. The system was... David's voice cracked. He clicked a third time, panic rising in his eyes like floodwater. "It was working in the test room. I confirmed it myself." "Perhaps you should have confirmed it here." Victoria's voice was silk over steel. "Yes, ma'am, you're absolutely right. I should have..." David fumbled with his tablet, trying to pull up the presentation manually. "If you could just give me one moment to You've had all morning, Mr. Chen." "I understand, but the system malfunction wasn't..." "Whose responsibility is system functionality?" The question hung in the air like an executioner's blade. David's face went pale. "Mine, ma'am." "And yet here we are. 20 executives waiting because you failed to perform the single most basic requirement of your position." Victoria's voice never rose, never sharpened. It didn't need to. The coldness was more devastating than any shout. "Tell me, Mr. Chen, what do you think this says about your capability to lead technical development?" I can fix it, Ms. Hale, if you'll just..." "That wasn't my question." David's mouth opened and closed. Around the table, other executives studied their hands, their tablets, the view outside, anywhere but the humiliation happening in front of them. Several had been in David's position before. They knew this script by heart. "What it says," Victoria continued, standing now, moving around the table with the patient stalking of a predator, "is that you're unreliable, that when pressure arrives, you crumble, that this company cannot depend on you when it matters most." She stopped directly across from David, the table between them feeling increasingly insufficient as protection. "Do you disagree with this assessment?" "No, ma'am." David's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you." "No, ma'am." Louder now, breaking. "Then we're in agreement that your performance today has been, with all due respect, ma'am, crushing someone's spirit won't fix the problem." Every head snapped toward the door. Standing in the entrance, one hand still on the handle, was a man none of them had seen before. He wore the gray uniform of building maintenance, with Brooks stitched above the breast pocket. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of weathered hands that spoke of real work, not keyboards and conference calls. His face was open, honest, with crow's feet at the corners of dark eyes that held no fear whatsoever. He was holding a mop. The silence that followed was so profound that several people wondered if they'd hallucinated the interruption. No one spoke to Victoria Hale like that. No one interrupted her meetings. No one, especially not a janitor, challenged her in front of her executive team. Victoria turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "Excuse me?" The man, Brooks, according to his uniform, stepped into the room without hesitation. "I said crushing someone's spirit won't fix the problem. The presentation system's malfunction isn't about incompetence. It's about a faulty cable connection in junction box 7B that maintenance was supposed to address last week but didn't." He gestured with his mop handle toward the screen. "I can have it working in 3 minutes if you'd like. Or you can continue making Mr. Chen feel worthless for something that wasn't entirely his fault. Your choice." The room was so still that a few executives weren't sure they were still breathing. Marcus, standing by the wall with his tablet, had gone the color of old parchment. David Chen looked like he might faint or cry or both. And Victoria? Victoria's eyes narrowed to slits of ice. "Who are you?" "Ethan Brooks. Started Monday in facility maintenance. And I apologize for interrupting, but I was fixing a leak in the ceiling panel outside and heard the situation." Ethan set his mop against the wall with a casualness that seemed almost aggressive in its normalcy. Seems like everyone's focused on blame instead of solutions, and that struck me as inefficient. Inefficient, Victoria repeated the word like it was a foreign language. You, a janitor who's been here less than a week, are lecturing me about efficiency? Not lecturing, ma'am. Observing. Ethan moved toward the presentation equipment at the front of the room, undeterred by the 20 pairs of eyes tracking him like surveillance cameras. See, where I come from, when something breaks, you fix it. You don't spend 20 minutes making someone feel small about it breaking. That's just wasted time. He crouched beside the console, opened a panel with practiced ease, and began examining connections. Mr. Chen, can you try your remote now? David, too stunned to disobey, clicked the remote. The screen flickered, then blazed to life with his presentation title slide. Relief washed over his face like rain. There you go. Ethan closed the panel and stood, wiping his hands on his uniform. Cable connection was corroded. Happens in buildings this old when humidity gets in the conduits. Not something your IT department would catch. It's a physical infrastructure issue. He looked directly at Victoria, his gaze level and unwavering. Mr. Chen's presentation is ready now. Seems like the most efficient use of everyone's time would be to hear it. For a long moment, Victoria simply stared at this janitor who'd walked into her domain, fixed her problem, and implicitly called her cruel, all without a trace of fear or apology. Something dangerous flickered in her eyes, something that made Marcus seriously consider updating his resume before the day ended. Then Victoria spoke, her voice soft as falling snow and twice as cold. Mr. Brooks, thank you for your assistance. You may return to your duties. It was a dismissal, a clear, unmistakable order from a woman whose orders were never questioned. Ethan nodded. Sure thing. But before he turned to leave, he looked at David Chen and said something that no one expected. Good luck with your presentation, Mr. Chen. From what I saw on that title slide, looks like solid work. Then he picked up his mop and walked out, leaving behind a room full of people who couldn't quite process what had just happened. Victoria returned to her seat with glacial composure, every line of her body radiating controlled fury. Mr. Chen, you may proceed. David's presentation, a comprehensive analysis of server optimization protocols that would save the company $3.2 million annually, went flawlessly. His voice steadied as he moved through the data, his confidence returning with each slide. It was brilliant work, actually, the kind of innovative thinking that separated good companies from great ones. Victoria barely heard a word of it. Her mind was locked on the janitor who dared to challenge her, Ethan Brooks. The audacity of it was staggering, the sheer, unthinking courage, or stupidity, she couldn't decide which, to walk into her meeting, contradict her, and then speak to her as if she were just another person. Not a billionaire, not a CEO, not the woman whose reputation made Fortune 500 executives sweat. Just a person. It was intolerable. When David finished his presentation to genuine applause, soft and brief but present, Victoria gave a single nod. Acceptable. Implementation budget approved. Next item. The meeting continued for another 90 minutes, covering acquisition strategies, market expansion proposals, and quarterly performance metrics. Victoria participated with her usual ruthless precision, but a corner of her mind remained fixed on that moment of interruption, on the man who'd looked at her without fear. She hated it. She hated him for it. And beneath the hatred, something else stirred, something she couldn't quite name and refused to examine. Curiosity, perhaps, or the unsettling recognition that someone had finally done what no one else had dared to do in 15 years, treat her like she was wrong. When the meeting finally ended and executives filed out with the relieved expressions of prisoners granted parole, Victoria remained in her seat, staring at the presentation screen now displaying the company logo. Marcus approached cautiously, like someone approaching a sleeping lion. Ms. Hale, should I contact HR about the janitor? Victoria was silent for a long moment, then, no, leave it. Marcus blinked. Ma'am? You heard me. Victoria stood, smoothing her jacket. Mr. Brooks fixed the problem. That's what we pay maintenance to do. There's nothing to report. It was a lie, and they both knew it. But Marcus nodded, grateful not to be the one carrying out whatever punishment Victoria was surely planning. Of course, Ms. Hale. Your 11:30 with the board is in 20 minutes. I'm aware. As Victoria walked back to her office, her heels clicking in rhythm with her heartbeat, she passed a maintenance closet on the 71st floor. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap she could see Ethan Brooks inside, organizing cleaning supplies with the same methodical competence he'd shown with the presentation equipment. He looked up as she passed, met her eyes directly, and nodded. A simple acknowledgement, neither afraid nor defiant. Just there. Victoria didn't break stride, didn't acknowledge the gesture. But as she entered her office and closed the door, shutting out the world with its usual finality, she found herself standing at the window, looking out over the city she'd conquered, and wondering why one janitor's opinion bothered her more than the combined judgment of every executive in her empire. The rest of the day proceeded with mechanical precision. Conference calls with London and Singapore. A contract negotiation where she'd extracted 3 additional percentage points by simply staying silent until the other party grew uncomfortable enough to offer them. A shareholders' meeting where her quarterly report had been received with the appropriate mixture of awe and intimidation. Normal. Controlled. Perfect. Yet twice that afternoon, Victoria found herself pausing in the middle of sentences, her mind drifting to a man with a mop who'd looked at her humiliation of an employee and decided it was inefficient. Not cruel, not wrong, not morally questionable. Inefficient. The word irritated her like a grain of sand in an oyster, small but impossible to ignore. It implied that her methods weren't just harsh, they were wasteful. That fear, her most reliable tool, was somehow less effective than, what? Kindness? Understanding? The soft, useless emotions she'd carved out of herself years ago? At 6:47 p.m., as the sun began its descent behind the Jersey skyline, Victoria stood in her empty office and made a decision. Tomorrow, she would learn more about Ethan Brooks. Not to punish him. That would be too easy, too expected. But to understand what kind of man challenged a billionaire CEO without a trace of fear, to understand what he had that she'd lost so long ago, she could barely remember what it felt like. To understand why, for the first time in 15 years, someone had made her question whether being feared was the same thing as being powerful. 73 floors below, Ethan Brooks clocked out at 7 o'clock p.m. exactly, same as always. He nodded to the night security guard, stepped out into the Manhattan evening, and pulled his phone from his pocket. One new message from his daughter Lily's after-school program coordinator. "Lily did great today. See you tomorrow." Ethan smiled, genuine, warm, completely unlike anything that ever crossed Victoria Hale's face in her tower of glass and steel. He pocketed the phone and headed for the subway, already thinking about dinner and homework and bedtime stories, the real work of his life. He didn't think about Victoria Hale at all, but she was still thinking about him. And in the careful architecture of her controlled world, that simple fact was the first crack in a foundation she'd spent decades building, brick by brutal brick, fear by calculated fear, until she'd created a fortress so impenetrable that no one could reach her, not even herself. The tower lights blazed against the darkening sky, a monument to success and power. Inside, cleaning crews began their nightly routines, vacuuming executive carpets and emptying prestigious trash cans, invisible in the way that servants have always been invisible to those in power. Except now Victoria Hale had seen one of them, really seen him, and she couldn't unsee what that encounter had revealed, that perhaps the Emperor's new clothes were actually armor, and armor was just another word for prison. The city hummed on, indifferent to the small drama that had unfolded in one corporate boardroom. A janitor had spoken truth to power. Power had listened, despite itself. And somewhere in the machinery of those two lives beginning to intersect, the gears of change had begun to turn, slowly, painfully, but inevitably. The question was whether Victoria Hale would recognize that change before it destroyed everything she'd built, or whether she'd discover that destruction was exactly what she needed. Victoria Hale didn't sleep well that night. She lay in her penthouse bedroom, all white marble and minimalist furniture that looked more like an art installation than a place where humans rested, and stared at the ceiling, replaying the boardroom scene with surgical precision. Every word, every gesture. The way Ethan Brooks had moved through her space with the confidence of someone who belonged there, not because of title or wealth, but because he simply existed, and that was enough. It was infuriating. At 4:23 a.m., she gave up on sleep entirely and went to her home office, pulling up the HR files on her private server. Ethan Michael Brooks, age 37, hired through the facilities management contractor 5 days ago. Previous employment? Construction supervisor, elementary school maintenance director, briefly unemployed. Education? Associate degree in building systems technology, some college but no bachelor's. Marital status, widowed. Dependents, one daughter, age 9. Victoria studied his employment photo, a straightforward headshot where he looked directly at the camera with that same unwavering gaze he'd given her in the conference room. No practiced smile, no attempt to appear more impressive than he was, just himself. She closed the file with more force than necessary, the laptop clicking shut like a trap. The widowed part caught in her mind like a hook. So he understood loss. That explained nothing about why he'd thought it appropriate to lecture her about management style, but at least it suggested he wasn't completely naive about how the world worked. Though if he thought losing a spouse gave him insight into running a multi-billion-dollar corporation, he was more foolish than she'd initially assessed. By the time Victoria arrived at her office at 5:52 a.m., 5 minutes later than usual, a deviation that annoyed her, she'd decided on a strategy. She would observe. Watch this Ethan Brooks in his natural environment, see what kind of man he really was when he wasn't grandstanding in executive meetings. People always revealed their true selves when they thought no one important was watching. What Victoria didn't anticipate was how difficult it would be to observe someone who seemed to exist everywhere at once. Over the following 3 days, she began noticing Ethan Brooks with the kind of irritating frequency that suggested either cosmic conspiracy or the simple fact that she'd never paid attention to maintenance staff before. He was in the executive break room at 7:15 a.m., fixing a coffee maker that had been broken for 2 weeks, chatting easily with the early arriving assistants who normally moved through the space like frightened mice. He was on the 43rd floor during lunch, helping a visibly pregnant analyst whose arms were full of file boxes, carrying them to her desk while she thanked him profusely. He was in the parking garage at 6:30 p.m., jump-starting a nervous intern's dead battery while explaining exactly what had gone wrong and how to prevent it next time. And everywhere he went, people responded to him, actually smiled at him, spoke to him like he was a person worthy of conversation, not just invisible hands that emptied trash and mopped floors. It was bizarre. On the 4th day after the boardroom incident, Victoria found herself in the unusual position of riding the elevator down to the 52nd floor personally instead of summoning people to her office. The CFO, Richard Pembroke, had requested an in-person discussion of the European expansion financials, and something in his voice had suggested the news wasn't good enough to be delivered in Victoria's presence without the buffer of his own territory. The elevator doors opened, and she stepped into the reception area of the finance department just in time to witness something that made her pause mid-stride. Ethan Brooks was crouched beside a desk where a young woman, couldn't have been more than 25, clearly junior staff based on her plain blouse and the anxiety etched into her expression, was staring at her computer screen with the kind of despair usually reserved for natural disasters. "I don't understand," the woman was saying, her voice trembling. "I saved it. I know I saved it. 3 weeks of work and it's just gone." "Okay, let's take a breath," Ethan said calmly, his hands resting on his knees as he studied the screen. "Computer problems always feel like the end of the world, but most of the time there's a solution. Tell me exactly what happened." "I was working on the quarterly reconciliation report and the system froze, and I had to force quit, and when I opened it again the file was corrupted. Everything's gone." A tear rolled down her cheek, which she wiped away quickly, embarrassed. "Mr. Pembroke is going to kill me. This was due yesterday. First thing, nobody's going to kill you over a computer problem. Second thing, corrupted doesn't always mean gone. Do you have auto backup enabled?" I don't know. I'm not good with technology." Ethan stood, rolled up his sleeves, a gesture so casual it seemed almost defiant in this temple of business formal, and leaned over the keyboard. "Let's find out. What's the file name?" Victoria watched as Ethan navigated through system folders with surprising competence for someone whose job description involved mops and cleaning supplies. His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, opening directories and running recovery protocols that most of the IT staff would have fumbled through. "There," he said after about 90 seconds. "Auto backup captured a version from about 3 hours ago. You'll have to redo this morning's work, but the bulk of it is intact." The woman's relief was so palpable that she actually made a small sound, half laugh and half sob. "Oh my God, thank you. Thank you so much. I thought I was going to get fired." "Nobody should get fired for a computer crash," Ethan said, opening the recovered file for her. "That's just technology being technology. Now you know about the backup system, though, so next time won't be as scary." He straightened, offering her a reassuring smile. "And for what it's worth, anyone who'd fire you over an accident isn't worth working for anyway." That's when he noticed Victoria standing 15 feet away, watching. His expression didn't change, no fear, no surprise, just acknowledgement. He nodded, the same simple gesture he'd given her in the hallway days before, then picked up his supply cart and walked past her toward the elevator. Victoria remained frozen for a moment, processing what she'd just witnessed. Then she continued to Pembroke's office, where the CFO delivered his news about European market complications with appropriate gravitas, and she responded with her usual incisive questions and decisive directives. But a corner of her mind remained fixed on what Ethan had said to that junior analyst. Anyone who'd fire you over an accident isn't worth working for anyway. The implicit criticism was unmistakable. He might as well have looked directly at Victoria and said, "Your leadership style is garbage." That evening, instead of working until 9 p.m. as she normally did, Victoria left at 7:15 and found herself doing something she hadn't done in years, walking through the building's lower floors without purpose or destination. Just observing. On the 38th floor, she saw Ethan helping the night security guard understand a new electronic time card system, his patience evident as he walked the older man through each step twice. On the 29th floor, he was repairing a broken chair for a custodian who'd been making do with the wobbly furniture rather than request a replacement because nobody listens to maintenance requests anyway. On the 17th floor, he was showing an intern how to properly recycle electronics instead of throwing them in regular trash, explaining the environmental impact in a way that was educational rather than preachy. And everywhere, that same quality. People trusted him, spoke to him freely, smiled at him with genuine warmth, not the calculated professional pleasantness that everyone showed Victoria. By the time she returned to her office, Victoria felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not quite anger anymore. Something more uncomfortable. It might have been jealousy. The next morning, Victoria broke her routine entirely. Instead of arriving at 5:47 a.m., she came at 7:30, timing it deliberately. The executive break room was fuller at this hour, assistants and junior managers grabbing coffee before the day's chaos began. And there, as she'd predicted, was Ethan Brooks, replacing the water bottle on the cooler. "Morning, Ms. Hale," he said without looking up, his tone exactly as casual as it had been with everyone else. No special deference, no fear. "Mr. Brooks." Victoria poured herself coffee she didn't want, just to have a reason to linger. Around them, the usual morning chatter had died the moment she entered, replaced by the familiar, uncomfortable silence. "I've noticed you have quite a range of skills beyond janitorial work." "Maintenance is more than mopping floors," Ethan replied, finally looking at her as he hefted the empty water bottle. "Buildings are complex systems. You learn to fix whatever needs fixing. Including people problems, apparently." Ethan's expression flickered with something, amusement, maybe. "I help where I can, not claiming to fix anything. Yet you felt qualified to interrupt my executive meeting to offer management advice." Here it was, the confrontation Victoria had been circling for days. The people in the break room had gone so still they could have been mannequins. Even the coffee maker seemed to stop gurgling. But Ethan just met her gaze steadily. "I offered a technical solution to a technical problem. The management-style observation was just an aside. Maybe out of line, but I've never been great at keeping quiet when I see someone being hurt unnecessarily." "Hurt?" Victoria repeated the word like it was a foreign concept. "Mr. Chen is a highly compensated executive who failed to meet basic expectations. Pointing that out isn't hurting him." "Wasn't just pointing it out, though, was it?"
Ethan leaned against the counter, completely at ease in a way that should have been inappropriate, but somehow wasn't. You were humiliating him, making an example.
I get the strategy. Keep everyone scared, keep them performing, but scared people don't innovate. They just survive. The silence in the break room had reached suffocating levels. Victoria could feel a dozen pairs of eyes watching this interaction like spectators at a car crash. You presume to understand my leadership philosophy after less than 2 weeks in this building? I presume to understand people after 37 years on the planet, Ethan said simply. Fear's a tool, sure, but it's a blunt one. And eventually, it's all people associate with you. Not respect, not loyalty, just fear. He picked up the empty water bottle, preparing to leave. But hey, you've built $1 billion company, so clearly you know what you're doing. I'm just the janitor. He walked out before Victoria could formulate a response, leaving her standing in a break room full of people who suddenly found their coffee cups fascinating. Marcus appeared at her elbow like a well-trained ghost. Miss Hale, your 8 a.m. is waiting in conference room A. Victoria followed him out, her mind churning. The casual dismissal, I'm just the janitor, had been more pointed than any argument. It highlighted the absurdity of their interaction. Why was a billionaire CEO engaging in philosophical debate with maintenance staff? Because he's the only person who talks to you like you're human, a small voice in her head whispered. She crushed that voice immediately. The pattern continued over the following week, and Victoria found herself increasingly aware of Ethan's presence in the building's ecosystem. Not because he was intrusive or attention-seeking, but because his absence would have been conspicuous. He'd become a fixture, someone people sought out when they needed help that went beyond job descriptions. On Tuesday, she overheard 2 executives discussing a family crisis in hushed tones near the elevator, and watched as Ethan, passing by with a floor buffer, paused to offer the name of a good family counselor his daughter's school had recommended, delivered with such genuine compassion that the executive looked near tears with gratitude. On Wednesday, Victoria emerged from a particularly brutal contract negotiation to find half her executive team gathered in the hallway, laughing. Laughing. In her building, where laughter was usually a sign that someone had forgotten where they were and would soon remember with regret. The source was Ethan, telling some story about a disastrous plumbing incident at his daughter's school play that somehow involved a rogue hamster and the fire department. On Thursday, she watched through her office window as Ethan spent his lunch break in the small plaza in front of the building, sitting with one of the elderly security guards just talking. Both men were laughing, easy and comfortable, sharing sandwiches like old friends, though they couldn't have known each other more than 2 weeks. And on Friday, Victoria's carefully controlled world began to truly crack. It started with Margaret Chen, David Chen's mother, showing up unannounced at the reception desk. Margaret was 70-something, tiny and fierce, the kind of elderly Asian woman who'd raised her children with iron discipline and unconditional love in equal measure. Victoria's receptionist buzzed through with obvious discomfort. Ms. Hale, there's a Mrs. Chen here who insists on speaking with you about her son David. She doesn't have an appointment, but she's very persistent. Victoria considered having security remove her. That would have been the efficient response. But curiosity won out. Send her up. Margaret Chen entered Victoria's office with the fearlessness of someone who'd survived things that made billionaire disapproval seem trivial. She wore a practical coat and carried a worn purse, and she looked at Victoria with eyes that had seen through far more impressive facades. Ms. Hale, thank you for seeing me. Mrs. Chen, what can I do for you? Victoria remained seated, a power play she'd used 1,000 times. Margaret wasn't impressed. You can stop breaking my son's spirit. He came home last week looking like he'd been gutted, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, all because you decided to humiliate him in front of his colleagues over a technical problem that wasn't his fault. Victoria's expression remained neutral. Your son's performance is between him and this company. I don't discuss personnel matters with... I'm not here for discussion, Margaret interrupted, and the steel in her voice could have cut diamonds. I'm here to tell you that David is a good man. He's brilliant at his job. He works 16-hour days trying to meet your impossible standards. And one technical failure, one moment of bad luck, and you treated him like he was worthless. I treated him according to the standards we maintain here.
You treated him like he was disposable. Margaret stepped closer to the desk, and Victoria found herself resisting the urge to lean back. My son is not disposable. He's a human being with feelings and dignity, and just because you've forgotten what those things mean doesn't give you the right to strip them from others. The words hit like a physical blow. Victoria's hands clenched involuntarily beneath the desk. Mrs. Chen, I think you should leave. I'll leave. But first you should know that the only reason David didn't resign last week was because of that janitor, Ethan Brooks. David was drafting his resignation letter that evening, couldn't stop shaking, convinced his career was over. And Mr. Brooks, who'd never even met my son before that day, tracked him down in the parking garage, sat with him for an hour, talked him through it, reminded him that one person's cruelty doesn't define his worth. Margaret headed for the door, then paused, looking back. My son stayed because someone showed him kindness when you showed him contempt. You might want to think about what that says about your leadership, Ms. Hale. Not the billion-dollar kind, the human kind. Then she was gone, leaving Victoria alone with words that seemed to echo in the suddenly too large office. For several minutes, Victoria simply sat, staring at the space where Margaret Chen had stood. The accusation of cruelty shouldn't have bothered her. She'd been called worse. She'd been called ruthless, merciless, a corporate ice queen, the devil in designer suits. None of it had ever mattered because results mattered, success mattered, the architecture of power mattered. But you've forgotten what those things mean, feelings and dignity that lodged somewhere uncomfortable. Because it was true, she had forgotten. Or more accurately, she deliberately excised those weaknesses from herself years ago, carved them out like tumors because they made you vulnerable, made you weak, made you into the kind of person who could be betrayed and destroyed. Like she'd been destroyed once, in another lifetime, before she'd rebuilt herself into something that couldn't be broken again. Victoria stood abruptly and walked to her window, looking down at the city that had been her kingdom and her prison for 15 years. 73 floors below, the plaza was busy with lunch hour traffic, and there, sitting on the same bench as yesterday, was Ethan Brooks. He wasn't alone. David Chen sat beside him, the two men deep in conversation. As Victoria watched, Ethan said something that made David laugh. Actually laugh, head thrown back, genuine and free. Then David seemed to be explaining something technical, gesturing with his hands, and Ethan listened with focused attention, nodding, asking questions. Two men who had nothing in common except humanity, connecting like it was the simplest thing in the world. Because for them, it was. Victoria pulled out her phone and did something unprecedented. She called down to facilities management directly. This is Victoria Hale. I need to see the complete work history and performance evaluations for Ethan Brooks. 20 minutes later, the files arrived. Victoria spread them across her desk, reading with the same intensity she brought to merger documents and market analyses. What she found was fascinating. Ethan had been a construction supervisor for 8 years, with consistently excellent reviews praising his leadership, problem-solving abilities, and crew morale. Then 3 years ago, there was a 6-month gap in employment. When he'd returned to work, it was in lower-paying positions. Elementary school maintenance, then briefly at a community center, now here. The gap coincided with his wife's death, Victoria realized. The dates lined up. And after that loss, he deliberately stepped back from high-pressure supervisory roles, choosing instead to work positions that let him be present for his daughter. He'd sacrificed career advancement for parenthood, chosen human connection over professional achievement. The choice was so foreign to Victoria's understanding of the world that it might as well have been written in an alien language. That evening, as staff filtered out and the building emptied toward its nighttime skeleton crew, Victoria did something else unprecedented. She left her office at 6:45 p.m. and went looking for Ethan Brooks. She found him on the 44th floor, his utility cart parked beside him as he replaced fluorescent bulbs in the hallway ceiling fixtures. He worked methodically, efficiently, but without the frantic pace that characterized most people in this building. There was something almost meditative about his movements. Mr. Brooks? He looked down from his stepladder, unsurprised to see her. Ms. Hale, something I can help you with?
I had an interesting visitor today, Margaret Chen.
Ethan's expression shifted, warmth entering his eyes.
She's something, isn't she? Reminds me of my late mother-in-law.
steel spine, heart of gold. She informed me that you prevented her son from resigning. I talked with him, if that's what you mean. Ethan climbed down from the ladder, carrying the old bulb to his cart. He was pretty shaken up. Seemed like he could use someone to remind him that a bad day doesn't mean a bad career. You barely know him. Don't need to know someone well to recognize when they're hurting. Ethan pulled a new bulb from his cart, unwrapping it carefully. Besides, he's clearly talented. Losing him over wounded pride would have been bad for everyone. Wounded pride? Is that what you think my management style is about? Ethan paused, the new bulb in his hands, and for the first time since she'd met him, his expression showed something like weariness. Ms. Hale, I don't know what your management style is about. I don't know your history or your reasoning or what made you decide that fear was the best tool in your kit. And honestly, it's not my business. But you have opinions about it anyway. I have observations. There's a difference. He climbed back up the ladder. I observe that people in this building are terrified of you. I observe that talented folks are more focused on avoiding your anger than on doing their best work. I observe that you've built something impressive, but you've done it alone. And loneliness looks the same whether you're in a penthouse or a cardboard box. The last sentence hit Victoria like ice water. You know nothing about my life. You're right, I don't. Ethan twisted the new bulb into place, the hallway brightening slightly. But I know something about loss, and I know that sometimes when we've been hurt badly enough, we decide that the safest thing is to never let anyone close enough to hurt us again. We build walls and call them strength. We choose isolation and call it independence. He climbed down again, meeting her eyes. And we become powerful, sure, but we stop being fully human. Victoria felt her jaw tighten. You're making a lot of assumptions, Mr. Brooks. Maybe, or maybe I'm just describing what I see. Someone brilliant and successful, and completely, utterly alone, who's convinced herself that alone is the same thing as safe. You're out of line. Probably. Ethan moved his cart toward the next set of lights. But being out of line seems to be my specialty around you. He continued working, dismissing her without actually dismissing her. Victoria stood in the hallway, anger and something else warring in her chest. She should fire him, should have him removed from the building immediately. He was insubordinate, presumptuous, completely inappropriate. Instead, she heard herself ask, "How do you do it?" Ethan paused, looking back at her. Do what? Connect with people so easily. They trust you immediately. Respond to you like... She struggled for words. Like you're someone who matters to them. For a long moment, Ethan just studied her, and Victoria had the uncomfortable sensation of being truly seen for the first time in years. Not assessed for usefulness or evaluated for threat level, just seen. I don't have a technique if that's what you're asking, he finally said. I just treat people like they're people. I listen to them. I remember that everyone's carrying something heavy, even if I can't see the weight, and I try to help when I can, not because it benefits me, but because that's what we're supposed to do for each other. He shrugged. It's not complicated, it's just hard when you've forgotten how. You think I've forgotten how to be human? I think you've practiced being powerful for so long that you might have lost track of the difference. The words should have felt like an attack. Instead, they felt like diagnosis, clinical and oddly gentle. Victoria found herself unable to formulate a response that wasn't either defensive or vulnerable, so she said nothing at all. Ethan filled the silence. My daughter Lily has this quote taped to her bedroom mirror. No idea where she got it, probably some teacher, but it says, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. He smiled slightly. Seems like good wisdom, for 9-year-olds and billionaires alike. Then he returned to his work, leaving Victoria standing in a hallway that seemed somehow different than it had been 10 minutes ago. The same walls, the same floors, the same corporate sterility. But the space felt less certain somehow, like the foundations had shifted slightly and everything was now at a subtle angle she couldn't quite correct. Victoria walked back to her office in silence, her mind churning with thoughts she hadn't entertained in years. Once inside, she didn't go to her desk. Instead, she stood at the window, watching the city lights bloom against the darkening sky, and tried to remember the last time anyone had made her feel anything other than feared. She couldn't. The realization should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like loss.
73 floors below, Ethan Brooks finished his shift and headed home to his small apartment where his daughter would be waiting with stories about school and questions about homework and requests for bedtime stories. His life was modest, unremarkable, filled with the ordinary struggles of single parenthood and bill paying and making sure there was enough peanut butter for the week. He didn't think about Victoria Hale at all that night. He made spaghetti for dinner, helped Lily with a math worksheet about fractions, read 3 chapters of her current favorite book about dragons and unlikely heroes, and tucked her into bed with kisses and I love yous that came as naturally as breathing. But Victoria thought about him. She thought about him while eating a catered meal alone at her desk. She thought about him while reviewing contracts that would shape markets but not lives. She thought about him while lying in her empty penthouse bed, staring at ceiling shadows, and wondering when exactly she'd traded connection for control and whether there was any way back from that transaction. And in the vast distance between their worlds, separated by money and power and choices made long ago in moments of pain, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not obviously, just a small crack in the armor Victoria had spent 15 years perfecting. A crack through which light might eventually enter if she could find the courage to let it. The change in Victoria was subtle enough that most people didn't notice. She still arrived early, still ran meetings with precision that bordered on surgical, still made decisions that shaped markets and careers with equal efficiency. But Marcus, who'd worked beside her for 6 years, noticed the small things. The way she paused half a second longer before delivering criticism. The way her eyes occasionally tracked maintenance staff moving through the executive floor. The way she'd stopped working quite as late, leaving at 8 instead of 10, though he had no idea what she did with those extra hours. What Victoria did with those hours was think and watch. And slowly, painfully, begin to question the empire she'd built from fear and distance. 2 weeks after her hallway conversation with Ethan, she implemented a policy change that shocked her executive team. Anonymous feedback forms where employees could report management concerns without fear of retaliation. It was a small gesture, almost meaningless given the culture of terror she'd cultivated. But it was something. The forms came back by the hundreds. Stories of casual cruelty, impossible standards, talented people leaving for lower-paying jobs just to escape the pressure. Victoria read every single one, alone in her office after everyone else had gone home, and felt the weight of what she'd created settle onto her shoulders like concrete. She'd built a prison, and she was both warden and inmate. But understanding the problem and solving it were different continents, and Victoria had no map for the territory between them. So she did what she'd always done when facing something she didn't understand. She observed, she analyzed, she tried to reverse engineer the formula that made Ethan Brooks so effortlessly human. It proved surprisingly difficult to study someone who wasn't trying to impress you. 3 weeks after the hallway conversation, on a Tuesday that started like any other, Victoria's carefully controlled world began to truly unravel. The first sign was minor, a flicker in the overhead lights during her 9 a.m. strategy meeting. Everyone paused, looked up, then continued when the light stabilized. Victoria made a mental note to have facilities check the electrical system, then promptly forgot about it as the discussion turned to the Tokyo acquisition that required her full attention. The second sign came at 10:17 a.m. when the climate control system began pumping air that was noticeably warmer than the precise 68 degrees Victoria mandated throughout the building. Her assistant called facilities. They promised to investigate. At 11:33 a.m., 3 elevator banks shut down simultaneously, trapping 2 executives between floors and forcing everyone else to use the stairs or wait for the 4 remaining functional elevators. The building engineer assured Victoria it was a minor software glitch, easily resolved. At 12:04 p.m., the building's backup generator kicked in for no apparent reason, causing a brief surge that crashed several computer systems on the lower floors. And at 12:47 p.m., every light in the Hale Industries tower went dark. Not dimmed, not flickering, completely, utterly dark. Victoria was in her office on a video call with the London team when her screen went black. The sudden absence of the computer's hum made the silence profound.
Through her window, she could see other buildings glowing with normal power, which meant this wasn't a grid failure. This was their building, their system, their problem. She stood, moving toward her office door with the muscle memory of someone who knew every inch of her territory. But opening the door revealed chaos. The executive floor, usually pristine and ordered, had transformed into confusion. People emerged from offices with their phone flashlights activated, voices rising in question and concern. What's happening? Is this a fire drill? My presentation was due in 20 minutes. Are we supposed to evacuate? Victoria's mind shifted immediately into crisis mode. She pulled out her phone, still charged, thank God, and called building security. The line was busy. She tried facilities management, same result. She tried Marcus, who appeared at her elbow almost immediately, his face pale in the dim light from the windows. Ms. Hale, building-wide power failure. Emergency lighting should have kicked in but didn't. Security is trying to determine if this is a cyber attack or... Get me the building engineer. Now! He's not responding. I think he's trapped in one of the elevators. Of course he was. Victoria's jaw tightened. 73 floors of confused, increasingly panicked employees, no emergency lighting, no functioning elevators, and no building engineer. The situation was rapidly deteriorating from inconvenient to dangerous. Tell security to start organized evacuation procedures. Stairwells only, orderly descent, no panic, and someone find out what the hell happened to our backup systems. Marcus nodded and disappeared into the darkness, his phone light bobbing like a firefly. Victoria stood in her doorway, watching her executives mill about with the purposeless confusion of people whose competence was entirely dependent on functional systems. Without computers, without lights, without the infrastructure they took for granted, they were helpless. It was, she realized with bitter irony, exactly how she'd felt during her conversation with Ethan about human connection. Competent in one domain, utterly lost in another. The thought of Ethan crystallized into a question. Where was facilities maintenance during this crisis? As if summoned by the thought, she heard his voice cutting through the confusion, calm and authoritative in a way that had nothing to do with title or hierarchy. Folks, I need everyone to stay calm and move toward the stairwells in an orderly fashion. Use your phone lights to see, and help anyone who needs assistance. We're going to get through this fine, but I need cooperation. Victoria moved toward the voice, finding Ethan in the central corridor with what appeared to be a battery-powered lantern, directing traffic like a conductor with an orchestra. People were actually listening to him, the panic in the air dissipating as his composure spread through the crowd. Mr. Brooks, Victoria said, reaching him. What's the situation? Ethan looked at her, and in the stark shadows cast by the emergency lantern, his expression was grimly serious. Main power is completely out. Or is... Backup generators failed to engage, which suggests either a software problem or physical damage to the transfer switches. Emergency lighting system is down, which should be impossible since it's on a separate circuit with independent battery backup. This isn't a simple outage, Ms. Hale. Something's fundamentally wrong with the building's electrical infrastructure. How long to fix it? Depends on what's wrong. Could be 20 minutes, could be 20 hours. He gestured to the evacuating crowd. Right now, priority is getting people out safely and making sure no one's trapped or injured. After that, I can investigate the systems. You? You're a janitor. The words came out more harshly than Victoria intended, sharpened by stress. But Ethan didn't flinch. I'm also a licensed electrician and former construction supervisor who's worked on building systems a lot more complex than this one. So, yes, me. Unless you've got someone better available? Victoria thought of her building engineer trapped in an elevator, her facilities manager who hadn't answered his phone, her entire technical team who were probably as panicked as everyone else. No, I don't. Then let me do my job. Ethan handed the lantern to a passing executive. Sarah, can you help guide people to the north stairwell? Stay calm, move slowly, make sure the elderly folks on this floor get assistance. Sarah, a senior VP who normally wouldn't take orders from anyone below C-suite level, nodded immediately and took the lantern without question. The automatic deference to Ethan's authority in this moment would have fascinated Victoria if she weren't so focused on the unfolding crisis. What do you need from me? She asked Ethan. He looked at her with something like surprise,
as if he'd expected her to demand rather than offer. Keep people calm and organized up here while I get down to the electrical room. If you can reach security, tell them not to call the fire department yet. Too many people on the stairwells already. Adding firefighters will create congestion. We've got time before this becomes a real emergency. How do you know that? Because the building's not on fire, structural integrity is fine, and the biggest danger right now is panic causing a stampede, which we prevent by staying calm and moving deliberately. He was already heading toward the stairwell, pulling a flashlight from his maintenance belt. I'll radio up when I know more. Then he was gone, descending into darkness, while Victoria stood in the center of controlled chaos, watching her executives and assistants and department heads navigate the crisis with varying degrees of competence. Some rose to the occasion, helping others and maintaining order. Others dissolved into complaint and helplessness, demanding solutions as if their positions entitled them to exemption from reality. Victoria spent the next 40 minutes doing something she'd never done before, actually working alongside her employees as equals. She helped an older accountant navigate the dark corridors to the stairwell. She carried boxes of critical files for a paralegal who couldn't manage them and the descent simultaneously. She answered questions she didn't have answers to with honesty instead of false certainty, and discovered that people responded better to, "I don't know yet, but we're working on it," than they ever had to her usual absolute declarations. By the time the 71st floor was mostly evacuated, with only essential personnel remaining, Victoria found herself in the emergency stairwell with Marcus and a handful of executives who'd refused to leave without her. "Ms. Hale, you should evacuate too," Marcus said. "We can coordinate from the plaza." "Not until we understand what happened." Victoria checked her phone. No word from Ethan, no updates from security. The building felt wrong in the darkness, like a body without a heartbeat. "Has anyone reached the building engineer?" "Fire department got him out of the elevator 10 minutes ago. He's shaken up but fine, said he has no idea what caused the failure. Everything was normal on his morning checks." Victoria's mind raced through possibilities. Cyber attacks seemed most likely, but the physical failure of multiple redundant systems suggested something more direct. Sabotage? Structural damage? A catastrophic equipment failure that somehow cascaded through every safety backup? Her phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number. "This is Brooks. Using maintenance phone. Found the problem. It's bad. Need you in the electrical room, sub-level 2. Victoria showed the message to Marcus. "I'm going down." "Ms. Hale, that's not—" "I'm going down," she repeated, her tone brooking no argument. "You coordinate evacuation from here. If I'm not back in 30 minutes, send security after me." She descended before Marcus could protest further, her phone flashlight casting wild shadows on the concrete stairwell walls. 73 floors down. Her legs would hate her tomorrow, assuming there was a tomorrow that wasn't consumed by whatever disaster had crippled her building. The sublevel electrical room was a cathedral of machinery, normally humming with the quiet power that kept 73 floors of commerce functioning. Now it was silent, except for the sound of Ethan moving through the darkness with a heavy-duty flashlight, examining junction boxes and circuit panels with systematic focus. "Mr. Brooks." He turned, and in the harsh flashlight beam, his face was grave. "You shouldn't be down here. It's not safe." "It's my building. Tell me what you found." Ethan gestured to a massive electrical panel on the far wall. Even Victoria, with no technical expertise, could see the damage. Scorch marks around several breakers, melted insulation, the acrid smell of burned wiring. Someone deliberately overloaded the main distribution panel, created a surge that fried the primary circuits, and here's the sophisticated part, also damaged the transfer switches for the backup generators. Everything that should have kept power running during a failure was systematically disabled. Victoria felt ice form in her stomach. Sabotage. Professional sabotage. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't just want to cause an outage. They wanted to create maximum chaos by ensuring nothing could come back online quickly. "Can you fix it?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, his flashlight playing over the damaged equipment. "The backup generators are intact. The transfer switches can be bypassed manually. I can restore partial power to emergency systems and about 40% of the building within an hour, maybe 2. But Ms. Hale, this isn't my biggest concern right now." What is? He moved to a different panel, forcing open a locked access door that revealed a tangle of data cables. Several were severed, cut with precision. Your server room is on sub-level 3. If they had access down here, they had access there. And if they went to this much trouble to disable power, they probably went to equal trouble with your data systems. The implications hit Victoria like a physical blow. Every contract, every acquisition file, every piece of proprietary information that made Hale Industries worth billions. If someone had breached the servers during the chaos, "I need to get to the server room." "Not without me," Ethan said firmly. "If someone's still down there, you're not going alone." They descended one more level in tense silence, the air growing cooler and more still. The server room door was ajar. Wrong. Immediately wrong. Because that door was supposed to be secured with biometric locks that wouldn't open without power unless someone physically broke through. Ethan entered first, flashlight sweeping the room. Banks of dark servers stood like tombstones, their usual symphony of fans and drives utterly silent. He moved methodically through the aisles, checking for physical damage or signs of data theft equipment. Victoria followed, her heart hammering. Years of work, decades of accumulated competitive advantage, all of it stored in these machines, now dark and vulnerable. "Clear," Ethan finally said. "No one's here. And honestly, I don't see signs of data extraction equipment. If they were here, they came and went before the power failed. Or they're planning to come back. Possible, which is why we need power restored and security tightened immediately." Ethan moved back toward the door. "Stay here. I'm going to manually engage the backup generators. Should take about 15 minutes. When power comes back, check your systems immediately." Ethan. His first name emerged before Victoria could stop it, born from fear she wasn't accustomed to feeling. "Be careful." He paused, turning back with an expression that was almost gentle. "Always am. I've got a 9-year-old depending on me." Then he was gone, and Victoria was alone in a room full of silent machines that contained the entirety of her professional life. She'd never felt so helpless. All her wealth, all her power, all her carefully constructed control, useless in the face of darkness and sabotage and the fundamental fragility of systems she'd taken for granted. She thought of what Ethan had said weeks ago. People will never forget how you made them feel. Right now, Victoria felt terrified, vulnerable, dependent on a janitor who knew more about the infrastructure of her empire than she did. It was the most honest feeling she'd had in 15 years. 14 minutes later, lights flickered and then blazed to life throughout the sublevel. The servers began their boot sequence, drives spinning up with sounds like mechanical breathing. Victoria's phone immediately flooded with notifications, texts, calls, alerts from every corner of her organization demanding explanation and instruction. But before she dealt with any of that, she called Ethan's maintenance phone. He answered on the first ring, slightly out of breath. "Generators are running. I've got about 40% of building power restored, focused on emergency systems and ground-level floors. Full restoration will take a professional electrical crew, probably tomorrow at earliest. The servers are booting. I need to assess potential data breach. Already called building security and told them to get cyber forensics in immediately. Also suggested they review security footage for the past week to see who had access to the sublevels." Victoria was silent for a moment, processing the fact that a janitor had thought 10 steps ahead while she'd been paralyzed by fear. "Thank you. Just doing what needs doing." A pause. "Ms. Hale, you should know. When I was down in the electrical room, I found something else. A timer mechanism, pretty crude but functional. Whatever happened today, it was designed to trigger during business hours for maximum disruption. Someone wanted to hurt your company specifically." The ice in Victoria's stomach spread to her limbs. This wasn't random corporate espionage. This was targeted, personal. "I need to get back upstairs." "Meet you in your office in 10 minutes. We need to talk about security protocols." Victoria spent the next 6 hours in controlled crisis mode, coordinating with cybersecurity, briefing the board, managing communications to prevent stock panic, and reviewing security footage with the building's security chief. The footage revealed nothing obvious. The sublevels showed normal maintenance access over the past week, no unfamiliar faces, no suspicious behavior. Whoever had done this knew the building's rhythms well enough to blend in perfectly. Through it all, Ethan worked alongside building security and the emergency electrical crew, his competence so evident that even the professional electricians deferred to his assessment of the damaged systems. He explained technical details to Victoria in terms she could understand, helped her prioritize which systems to restore first, and at one point physically prevented her from making a decision that would have saved money but compromised safety. No, he'd said flatly when she suggested bypassing certain inspections to get full power back faster. I don't care about your timeline. If those circuits aren't checked properly, we risk an actual fire next time there's a surge. Your impatience isn't worth people's lives. And Victoria, who hadn't been directly contradicted by anyone in her organization in years, had simply nodded and approved the longer timeline. By 7 p.m., the immediate crisis was contained. Partial power restored, critical systems secured, cyber forensics finding no evidence of data breach, and a plan in place for full restoration within 48 hours. The board was satisfied. The employees were safe. The damage was real, but manageable. Victoria stood in her office, now illuminated only by emergency lighting that cast strange shadows, and felt exhaustion crash over her like a wave. Not just physical tiredness from the stress and the 73 flights of stairs, but something deeper. Soul-level weariness from maintaining perfect control for so long that the first real crack had nearly shattered her completely. A knock on her open door. Ethan stood there, his maintenance uniform dirty and rumpled, his face lined with fatigue that matched her own. Heading out. Just wanted to let you know the night crew has been briefed on monitoring the backup systems, and the electrical contractor will be here at 6 a.m. to start full repairs. You're not leaving yet. It wasn't a question. Victoria moved to her desk where a bottle of whiskey, 25-year-old single malt that she kept for board celebrations, sat in a lower drawer. She pulled out 2 glasses, poured generous measures into each, and handed one to Ethan. I don't drink on the job, he said. You're off the clock. And after today, we've both earned this. Ethan hesitated, then took the glass. They stood in the dim office, the city lights beyond the windows painting them in amber and shadow, and drank in silence. The whiskey burned warm and real, cutting through the numbness. I would have failed today without you, Victoria said finally. No, you wouldn't have. You'd have figured it out. Not quickly enough. Not effectively enough. She stared into her glass. All my education, all my experience, all my authority, useless in an actual crisis. Meanwhile, you, a janitor, she caught herself. A maintenance worker with an associate degree and no executive title managed the situation better than anyone in my organization. That's not about intelligence or education, Ethan said quietly. It's about different kinds of knowledge. You know how to run a company. I know how to keep a building standing. Both matter. Today just happened to be a day when my skills were more immediately useful than yours. You're being generous. I'm being honest. You think I could negotiate a multi-billion-dollar acquisition? Could I manage international expansion strategies or navigate corporate law? I'd be lost in 5 minutes. We've got different expertise, that's all. Victoria shook her head. It's more than expertise. You stayed calm when I was terrified. You knew exactly what to do when I was paralyzed. You led people who should have been following me because you understand something I've forgotten. What's that? How to be someone worth following instead of someone to be feared. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable in a way Victoria hadn't allowed herself to be in years. Ethan studied her with those steady, dark eyes that had never shown fear of her power, and she wondered what he saw. A billionaire having a moment of weakness? A corporate tyrant experiencing brief humility before returning to form? Or something more fundamental, a human being finally acknowledging her own limitations? Fear's an expensive currency, Ethan said eventually. You spend it to buy compliance, but what you end up with is people who do exactly what you tell them and nothing more. They don't innovate. They don't speak up when they see problems. They certainly don't go the extra mile when crisis hits. He gestured toward the darkened building beyond her office. Today, when real trouble came, how many of your executives stepped up versus shut down? Victoria thought of the chaos on the 71st floor, the complaints, the demands, the handful who'd actually helped versus the majority who'd simply expected someone else to fix everything. Not enough. Because you've trained them to wait for your orders, to never act without permission, to prioritize avoiding your anger over doing what's right. Ethan finished his whiskey. That's what fear gets you. Obedience, but not initiative. Compliance, but not loyalty. And what does your approach get you? Today? People who trusted me enough to stay calm when they could have panicked. Electricians who listened to my assessment even though I'm not their supervisor. You standing in a server room you'd probably never visited before because you believed I'd keep you safe. He met her eyes. That's what trust gets you, Ms. Hale. People who'll walk through darkness with you instead of just doing what they're told. Victoria set her glass down carefully, her hands steadier than they'd been all day.
I don't know how to do that. Lead through trust instead of fear. It's not... She struggled for words. It's not in my toolbox. Then maybe it's time to learn some new tools. You make it sound simple. I make it sound possible. There's a difference. Ethan moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, you did something today I didn't expect. You came down to the sublevels when you could have stayed safe upstairs. You asked what I needed instead of demanding what you wanted. You admitted you didn't have all the answers. Those are small things, but they're good things. Starts of things. He left before Victoria could respond, his footsteps echoing down the hallway until they faded into the building's renewed mechanical hum. Victoria stood alone in her office, surrounded by the trappings of power that had failed her when it mattered most, and felt something shift in her chest. Not a dramatic transformation, not a sudden revelation. Just a small crack in the armor she'd worn for so long she'd forgotten there was skin underneath. Today, her building had gone dark. Her systems had failed. Her authority had proved meaningless against physical reality. And a janitor had saved her empire while teaching her the uncomfortable truth that power and strength weren't the same thing. That control and leadership weren't synonyms. That the fortress she'd built around herself was actually a cage. And the key had been in her hand all along. She'd just forgotten what keys were for. The city lights glittered beyond her window. Thousands of lives lived in thousands of small rooms, each one containing someone who laughed and cried and connected and mattered in ways that had nothing to do with balance sheets or market dominance. Somewhere out there, Ethan Brooks was riding the subway home to his daughter, his modest apartment, his ordinary life that was somehow richer than Victoria's billion-dollar empire because it contained something hers didn't. Love. Connection. The simple human reality of mattering to someone beyond what you could do for them. Victoria picked up her phone and scrolled through the hundreds of messages from her executive team. Status updates, damage assessments, questions about protocol and procedure. Not one of them asked if she was okay. Not one expressed concern for her well-being. They saw her as a decision-making machine because that's exactly how she'd taught them to see her. She'd built this isolation deliberately, brick by brick, wall by wall, until she was untouchable and unreachable, and completely, utterly alone, at the top of her tower of glass and steel and self-imposed exile from the human experience. For the first time in 15 years, Victoria Hale admitted to herself that she was lonely. Not just alone. She'd chosen alone. Had made peace with alone. But lonely, which was different. Lonely meant wanting connection you didn't have. Lonely meant recognizing that something fundamental was missing from the empire you'd built. Lonely meant finally understanding that you'd won every battle and lost the war. The office felt colder than usual despite the restored climate control. Victoria sat at her desk, surrounded by symbols of success that suddenly felt like participation trophies for a competition that didn't matter. Outside, the city lived and breathed and connected, while she sat alone 73 floors above it, having everything except the one thing that actually mattered. She thought of Ethan's daughter waiting at home with questions about school and requests for bedtime stories. She thought of Margaret Chen defending her son with the fierce love of someone who knew that people were more important than positions. She thought of David Chen laughing on a plaza bench, his dignity restored by simple human kindness. And she thought about how many years she'd wasted believing that power was enough, that success was sufficient, that being feared was better than being loved because fear couldn't betray you. But fear couldn't save you either, she'd learned today. When the lights went out and the systems failed and the crisis came, fear was useless. Only competence and kindness had mattered. Only human connection had solved what authority couldn't touch. Victoria pulled out a blank notepad, actual paper, something she rarely used in her digital empire, and began writing.
Not business plans or acquisition strategies, just thoughts, questions. The beginning of a map for territory she'd never explored. How do you learn to be human again after forgetting for 15 years? How do you build trust when you've perfected fear? How do you connect when you've mastered distance? She didn't have answers, but for the first time since she'd built her fortress, Victoria Hale admitted she needed them. And that admission, small and private and invisible to everyone except herself, was the first real step toward change. The building hummed around her, alive again, lights blazing in testament to restored power. But Victoria sat in the growing darkness of her office, having deliberately not turned on her desk lamp, and wondered if maybe darkness wasn't the enemy she'd always believed. Maybe darkness was just the space where you finally stopped pretending you could see everything and admitted you needed help finding the way. Victoria didn't go home that night. She stayed in her office until past midnight, sitting in the darkness she'd chosen, staring at the notepad where she'd written questions she didn't know how to answer. The building was quiet around her, just the hum of restored systems and the occasional footsteps of security making rounds. For once, the silence didn't feel like power. It felt like what it actually was. Emptiness. At some point, she must have dozed off at her desk because she woke to pale morning light filtering through the windows and a stiff neck that reminded her she wasn't 25 anymore. Her phone showed 6:47 a.m. and 32 missed messages. The electrical contractors would be arriving soon. The building would fill with people again. The machinery of her empire would resume its ruthless efficiency. But something had fundamentally shifted, and Victoria knew with absolute certainty that she couldn't go back to who she'd been 72 hours ago. She went home to shower and change, moving through her penthouse like a ghost haunting her own life. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. Immaculate, expensive, sterile. The furniture catalog had called the aesthetic modern minimalist. Looking at it now, Victoria saw it for what it really was. A space designed for someone who never really lived there. No photos, no personal touches, no evidence that a human being with a history and relationships and a life beyond work actually occupied these rooms. She'd created the same emptiness at home that she'd created at work. Total control. Total isolation. Total protection from anything that might hurt her. And it had worked perfectly, right up until the moment she realized that protection from pain was also protection from everything else worth experiencing. Victoria arrived at the office at 8:30 a.m., late by her standards, early enough that most people would still consider it impressive. The building was a controlled hive of activity, electrical contractors working on the damaged systems, while employees navigated around them with determined normalcy. The crisis was over. Life continued. But as she moved through the executive floor toward her office, Victoria noticed something she'd never paid attention to before. People weren't just avoiding her, they were diminishing themselves around her, making themselves smaller, quieter, less present, as if her proximity was a force field that compressed human personality into acceptable workplace blankness. She'd done that. Trained them to disappear around her, considered it professional efficiency when it was actually slow-motion cruelty. Marcus appeared with his tablet, ready to recite her schedule. Ms. Hale, the board wants a full briefing at 10. The cybersecurity team has preliminary findings, and there are approximately 40 messages requiring urgent— Marcus, Victoria interrupted him gently, which was itself so unusual that he stopped mid-sentence. Before we start, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. He looked wary. Of course, Ms. Hale. Are you afraid of me? The question hung in the air between them. Marcus's expression cycled through confusion, calculation, and finally a careful neutrality that was answer enough. I respect you tremendously, Ms. Hale. That's not what I asked. A long pause. Then, yes, everyone is afraid of you. That's just how it is. Victoria absorbed that confirmation, though it wasn't really new information. And does that fear make you better at your job? Marcus seemed to be deciding whether this was a trap. It makes me very careful, very thorough, very unlikely to make mistakes. But does it make you better? He met her eyes then, and she saw something flicker there, a glimpse of the human being beneath the professional assistant. No, it makes me safe. Those aren't the same thing. Victoria nodded slowly. Thank you for being honest. That must have been difficult. You have no idea, Marcus said with the faintest hint of dry humor, then immediately looked like he regretted it. But Victoria smiled, a real smile, not the sharp-edged expression that usually passed for one. Actually, I'm beginning to. Clear my schedule from 2 to 4 this afternoon. Marcus's fingers hovered over his tablet. Ms. Hale, the acquisition team has a presentation at 2:30 and reschedule it. This is more important. She left Marcus staring after her with an expression of profound confusion and went to find the person who'd somehow become the catalyst for her uncomfortable awakening. Ethan was on the 44th floor, helping the electrical contractors map the damaged circuits. He wore the same gray maintenance uniform, but Victoria noticed details she'd missed before, the way other maintenance staff deferred to him naturally, the easy competence with which he moved through technical work, the patience he showed explaining complex problems in simple terms. He looked up as she approached, unsurprised to see her. Ms. Hale, contractors say we'll have full power restored by this evening, no permanent damage to critical systems. That's excellent news. Mr. Brooks, I need to speak with you, privately. My office at 2 p.m. Something flickered across his face, not fear but perhaps wariness. Is there a problem? No, I just need to talk. Victoria hesitated, then added, Please. The please seemed to surprise him more than anything else. He nodded. I'll be there. Victoria spent the rest of the morning in meetings that felt increasingly surreal. The board briefing, where she delivered facts and projections with her usual precision, while internally questioning why any of it mattered if the people building the company were miserable. The cybersecurity review, where she learned the sabotage had been traced to a disgruntled former employee who'd maintained contractor access, a security gap that existed because no one had felt comfortable bringing potential problems to her attention. Every meeting revealed another crack in the foundation she'd built. And instead of trying to patch them, Victoria found herself examining them, understanding for the first time how much her leadership style had cost the organization beyond what quarterly reports could measure. At 1:45 p.m., she did something unprecedented. She walked to the executive break room where a cluster of her managers were having lunch, and she sat down with them. The conversation died instantly. People froze mid-bite, coffee cups suspended halfway to mouths. Baltiki. Please continue, Victoria said. I'm just taking a break. No one continued. They sat in excruciating silence until Victoria realized that her very presence had killed whatever ease had existed before she arrived. She was a black hole of normalcy, sucking the human out of every space she occupied. She stood. I apologize for interrupting. Then, because something new and uncomfortable was pushing at the walls she'd built, she added, For what it's worth, you all handled yesterday's crisis well. I should have said that earlier. You should hear it more often when you do good work. She left them staring after her and heard the explosion of confused whispers the moment she was out of earshot. At exactly 2 p.m., Ethan knocked on her open office door. Victoria gestured him inside, and he entered with the same unshakable calm he brought to everything. She'd arranged 2 chairs by the window, away from her desk, an attempt to make this feel less like a performance review and more like an actual conversation. Thank you for coming, Victoria said, settling into one chair while Ethan took the other. I wanted to talk about what you said yesterday, about fear and trust and leadership. Okay? Ethan said carefully, I need to understand how you do it, how you connect with people so easily, how you earn trust instead of demanding obedience. And before you tell me it's not complicated, I need you to understand that for me, it is. I don't have a template for this. I don't know how to be the kind of leader people follow because they want to rather than because they're afraid not to. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those steady eyes that had never flinched from her power. You're asking me to teach you something that can't really be taught. It's not a technique. It's not a set of phrases or behaviors you can adopt. It's about actually seeing people as people, not as functions in your organization. I do see them as people. Do you? Or do you see them as variables in an equation, resources to be managed, pieces on a board you're playing? He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I'm not trying to be harsh, Ms. Hale, but from what I've observed, you interact with humans the way most people interact with machinery. You input requirements and expect outputs. And when the outputs don't meet your standards, you treat it like a mechanical failure rather than a human struggling. The accuracy of the observation stung. That's how I was trained to lead. Set high standards, hold people accountable, don't accept excuses. It built a billion-dollar company. I'm sure it did. But what did it cost you? Victoria looked out the window at the city below, all those lives she'd spent years viewing as background scenery to her success. Everything that matters, apparently. The admission came out quieter than she'd intended, raw in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be since she was much younger and much more foolish. She felt Ethan's gaze on her, patient and non-judgmental, and something in his silence gave her permission to continue. I wasn't always like this, she said. I was different before, softer. I believed in collaboration and mentorship and building teams based on mutual respect. I thought if you were excellent at what you did and treated people well, success would follow. What changed? Victoria's hands tightened on the chair arms. She hadn't told this story in 15 years, hadn't even thought about it in detail, had buried it so deep that most days she could pretend it had happened to someone else entirely. But Ethan had shared his loss with her, widowed, raising a daughter alone, rebuilding a life from tragedy. Maybe honesty deserved honesty in return. I had a business partner, she began, the words coming slowly like drawing water from a deep well. Jonathan Reeves. We started a tech company together right out of business school. He was brilliant, charismatic, someone I trusted completely. We were friends. Or I thought we were. She paused, old anger stirring beneath the surface. For 3 years, we built something incredible together, revolutionary software that could have changed our industry. And I poured everything into it, my time, my money, my reputation. I believed in him, in us, in what we were creating. Ethan didn't interrupt, just listened with the complete attention that seemed to be his natural state. Then, 2 weeks before our major product launch, I discovered he'd been systematically stealing our proprietary code, copying it to a competitor in exchange for a position in their executive team and a significant equity stake. Everything we'd built, everything I'd invested, he sold out from under me to advance his own career. That's brutal, Ethan said quietly. It destroyed the company, destroyed my reputation in the industry for years. I lost everything, my savings, my credibility, my ability to trust my own judgment about people. Victoria's voice remained steady, but the old wounds were as fresh as ever beneath the scar tissue. Worse than the financial loss was the betrayal itself. I trusted him completely, considered him family, and he looked me in the eye every single day while systematically robbing me blind. So you decided never to trust anyone again. I decided that trust was a liability, that caring about people made you vulnerable, that the only safe way to operate was from a position of absolute control where no one could hurt you because no one was close enough to matter. Victoria met Ethan's eyes. I rebuilt myself from scratch, went ruthless, made fear my primary tool because fear is reliable in ways that loyalty and friendship aren't. Fear doesn't betray you. Fear doesn't steal from you. Fear just works. Until it doesn't, Ethan said. Until you end up alone at the top of a tower, successful beyond measure and completely isolated from every human connection that makes life worth living. The truth of it hit like a hammer. Victoria felt her throat tighten. I thought isolation was safety. I thought if I never let anyone close enough to matter, no one could hurt me again. And were you right? Victoria considered the question. Yes. No one's betrayed me in 15 years. No one's stolen from me. No one's used my trust against me. But no one's loved you either. No one's actually known you. You've been safe and successful and completely, utterly alone. Ethan's voice was gentle, without judgment. That's not victory, Ms. Hale. That's just surviving instead of living. The words broke something open in Victoria's chest, and she felt tears threatening for the first time in years. She blinked them back fiercely, refusing to cry in front of an employee. But Ethan had already seen them. It's okay to be hurt, he said. What happened to you was genuinely terrible. Being betrayed by someone you trust is one of the worst things a person can experience. You had every right to be angry and devastated and to take time to heal. But at some point, healing has to mean more than just building walls.
At some point, you have to decide that one person's betrayal doesn't mean all people are untrustworthy. That being hurt once doesn't mean you have to live in fear of being hurt forever. Victoria shook her head. You don't understand. When someone betrays you at that level, it doesn't just hurt. It changes you. Makes you question everything you thought you knew about reading people, about trusting your instincts. I couldn't afford to be wrong again.
So instead you chose to be alone forever. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Can I tell you about my wife? The shift caught Victoria off guard. If you want to. Rebecca died 3 years ago. Cancer. Started as something small, something treatable, then spread faster than anyone predicted. From diagnosis to death was 7 months. His voice remained steady, but Victoria could hear the grief beneath it, old and deep. She was 34. Lily was 6. We'd been together since college, and I'd never loved anyone or anything the way I loved her. I'm sorry. Thank you. It is the worst thing that ever happened to me. Watching someone you love deteriorate, knowing there's nothing you can do, feeling helpless while they suffer. He paused, looking out at the city. For months after she died, I was angry. Angry at the universe, at fate, at whatever you want to call the forces that took her from us. I felt betrayed by life itself. Here I'd done everything right, been a good husband, worked hard, built a stable life, and it didn't matter. She died anyway. Victoria felt her throat tighten with unexpected empathy. How did you survive it? Barely, at first. There were days I couldn't get out of bed, days I resented having to be strong for Lily when I wanted to fall apart, days I wished I could just stop existing because the pain was too much. Ethan's expression was raw now, honest in a way that made Victoria feel like she was witnessing something sacred. But Lily needed me. And slowly, so slowly I barely noticed it happening, I realized I had a choice. I could let Rebecca's death close me off from ever loving again, ever trusting life again, ever being vulnerable again. Or I could honor her memory by staying open to the world, by raising our daughter with the same warmth and connection she would have wanted, by choosing to believe that love was worth the risk of loss. That's different from betrayal. Is it? You both experienced something that made you feel like the world wasn't safe, like trusting in good outcomes was naive, like the only protection was distance. He met her eyes. The difference is, I decided that shutting down wasn't surviving. It was just dying more slowly. That if I closed myself off from pain, I'd also close myself off from joy, from connection, from every good thing that makes being human worthwhile. Victoria was quiet, absorbing this. But you chose a lower-paying job, stepped back from career advancement, limited your professional potential. I chose to be present for my daughter during the years she needs me most. I chose to work positions that let me leave at 5 p.m. and coach her soccer team and help with homework and tuck her in at night. I chose a life where I matter to someone, not because of what I can do, but because of who I am. He smiled slightly. Sure, I make less money, live in a small apartment instead of a penthouse. Won't be on any Forbes lists. But when I go home, there's someone who throws her arms around me and tells me about her day and falls asleep feeling safe because I'm there. Can you say the same? The question wasn't cruel, but it cut deep. Victoria thought of her empty penthouse, her non-existent personal life, the way she'd traded every human connection for professional achievement. No, I can't. Then maybe you need to ask yourself what kind of wealth actually matters. The kind that shows up in your bank account, or the kind that shows up in your life? They sat in silence for a long moment, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across Victoria's office. Outside, the city hummed with life. Millions of people connecting and disconnecting, loving and losing, building the small human networks that gave existence meaning beyond mere survival. I don't know how to start, Victoria finally said. How to be different than I've been for 15 years. I've forgotten how to be soft, open, the kind of person people trust instead of fear. You start small, Ethan said. You start by admitting when you're wrong, by asking people's opinions and actually listening to the answers, by remembering that the person cleaning your floors has a life as complex and meaningful as yours, even if it looks different from the outside. You make it sound simple. It is simple, just not easy. Ethan stood, checking his watch. I need to get back to work, but Ms. Hale, can I suggest something? Please. Stop calling everyone by their last names. Stop maintaining that formal distance like it's protecting you. Try calling me Ethan instead of Mr. Brooks. Try asking Marcus about his life instead of just his task list. Try treating your executives like humans who might have insights worth hearing instead of subordinates who exist to execute your vision. He moved toward the door, then paused. And maybe, when you're ready, try forgiving yourself for being betrayed. Because carrying that wound around for 15 years isn't strength, it's just exhausting. Then he was gone, and Victoria was alone with truths she'd spent years avoiding. She sat in her office as the afternoon stretched toward evening, watching the city transition from daylight to dusk. She thought about Jonathan Reeves, who she hadn't allowed herself to think about in years, about how his betrayal had felt like a death, like the murder of the person she'd been before she learned that trust was dangerous. She thought about Rebecca Brooks, who she'd never met but who suddenly felt vitally present. A woman who'd loved and been loved, who'd raised a daughter and built a marriage and lived fully right up until she couldn't anymore. Who'd left behind a widower who chose connection over safety, vulnerability over control. She thought about Ethan, who'd lost the love of his life and somehow remained capable of warmth and kindness and the generosity of spirit that Victoria had deliberately excised from herself. And she thought about who she'd become in her quest for invulnerability, successful, powerful, respected, feared, and completely, utterly alone. The realization that she'd wasted 15 years hiding from human connection hit her with physical force. She'd thought she was protecting herself. She'd actually been punishing herself, serving a life sentence for the crime of trusting someone who didn't deserve it. Victoria pulled out her phone and did something she never did. She scrolled through her contacts, hundreds of them, all professional connections, business relationships, useful people to know, and couldn't find a single person she'd call a friend. Not one person she could call just to talk. Not one human being who knew her as anything other than Victoria Hale, CEO, billionaire, industry titan. She'd built an empire and lost herself completely in the construction. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Board wants follow-up meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. Should I confirm? Instead of just replying yes, Victoria typed, confirm the meeting. Also, Marcus, thank you for everything you did during the crisis yesterday. Your calm under pressure made a real difference. I don't say that kind of thing often enough, but I should. She sent it before she could second-guess the impulse. 3 dots appeared immediately, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, thank you, Ms. Hale. That means a lot. It was a tiny gesture, barely worth noting, but it was also the first genuine human moment Victoria had shared with her assistant in 6 years of working together. She thought about what Ethan had said. Start small. Victoria spent the next hour doing something she'd never done before. She wrote personal notes, actual handwritten notes on her personal stationery, to 5 people in her organization. David Chen, thanking him for staying after the meeting humiliation and for his excellent work on the server optimization project. Sarah from the 71st floor, acknowledging her leadership during the evacuation. The building's lead security guard, expressing appreciation for his 20 years of service that she'd never previously acknowledged. Margaret Chen, apologizing for her treatment of David and thanking her for the courage to confront a billionaire on her son's behalf. And Ethan Brooks simply saying, thank you for your honesty, for your help during the crisis, and for reminding me that success without humanity is just expensive loneliness. I'm going to try to do better. She sealed each note in an envelope and left them with Marcus to deliver the next morning. It felt simultaneously too small to matter and terrifyingly vulnerable. She was admitting weakness, showing gratitude, being human in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be in 15 years. As Victoria finally left her office at 8 p.m., early, by her old standards, still later than most people worked, she passed through the now empty executive floor and noticed something she'd never seen before. On a cubicle wall, someone had taped a photo of 2 kids grinning at a soccer game. She'd walked past this cubicle hundreds of times and never noticed that photo, never thought about the person who worked there having a life beyond their job. She stopped, studying the photo, realizing that every single person in this building was someone's child, someone's parent, someone's friend. They had hopes and fears and dreams and disappointments. They cried and laughed and loved and lost.
They were complete human beings with inner lives as complex as her own, and she'd been treating them like machinery for 15 years. The weight of that recognition settled onto Victoria's shoulders, heavy as concrete. She couldn't undo 15 years of cruelty in an afternoon, couldn't fix the damage she'd done with a few handwritten notes. But she could start. She could choose right now to be different going forward. She could choose what Ethan had chosen after his wife's death, to stay open even when it hurt, to connect even when it was scary, to be vulnerable even when every instinct screamed for self-protection. She could choose to be human again. Victoria rode the elevator down to the parking garage, her mind full of thoughts that would have been unimaginable a week ago. As the doors opened, she saw Ethan's beat-up Honda in the distance, and on impulse, she headed toward it instead of toward her own Mercedes. He was loading his supply cart into the trunk when she approached, and he turned with mild surprise. "Ms. Hale, everything okay?" "Victoria," she said. "You're right that the distance isn't helping anything. You can call me Victoria." Ethan smiled slightly. "That might take some getting used to, for both of us." "I imagine a lot of things are going to take getting used to." She paused, uncertain how to say what she wanted to say. "I delivered those notes tomorrow, to David and the others, including you. I saw it on my cart. Haven't opened it yet. It just says thank you for your honesty, for challenging me." Victoria took a breath. "And I wanted to say something else about Rebecca. I'm genuinely sorry for your loss, but I'm grateful she existed because she clearly taught you how to love people well, and somehow that survived her death intact. That's remarkable." Ethan's expression softened. "She would have liked you, I think, the real you, underneath all the armor. She was good at seeing people that way, seeing who they were under what they showed the world." I'm not sure there is a real me anymore, just the armor." "There is. I've seen glimpses. The woman who came down to the sublevels during the crisis. The woman who admitted she was scared. The woman who sat in my office today and was honest about her history instead of hiding behind authority." Ethan closed his trunk. "She's still in there. You just have to decide she's worth letting out." Victoria nodded, not trusting her voice. Ethan climbed into his car, gave her a small wave, and drove off into the night. She stood in the parking garage for a long moment, surrounded by expensive cars that their owners used to commute between work and empty homes, and felt the full weight of the choice in front of her. She could go back to who she'd been, safe, successful, untouchable, alone. Or she could try to become someone different, someone vulnerable, connected, human, alive. The first option was easier, the second was terrifying. But as Victoria drove home through streets full of people living their messy, complicated, beautifully human lives, she thought about Ethan tucking his daughter into bed, about Margaret Chen defending her son with fierce maternal love, about the photo on the cubicle wall of kids at a soccer game, and she thought about dying alone in her penthouse someday, successful and wealthy and unmourned by anyone who'd actually known her. For the first time in 15 years, that future looked less like victory and more like the saddest thing she could imagine. Change was terrifying, but loneliness was worse. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to remember how to be human. The next morning, Victoria arrived at the office at 7:45 a.m. Still early, but no longer obsessively so. She'd slept better than she had in months. Though her dreams had been strange and unsettling, full of locked doors she was finally learning to open. The building felt different as she entered, or perhaps she was different, and the building simply reflected that change back at her. Marcus met her at the elevator with his usual tablet and efficient demeanor, but this time Victoria noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the careful way he held himself in her presence. She'd done that to him, trained him to approach her like someone approaching a sleeping predator. "Morning, Marcus. Before we go through the schedule, I wanted to ask, how's your mother doing? You mentioned she was having hip surgery last month." Marcus's expression cycled through surprise, confusion, and finally cautious warmth. She's doing much better, actually. Thank you for asking, Ms. Hale. The physical therapy is helping." "I'm glad to hear it. That must have been stressful for you, trying to support her while managing everything here." "It was manageable," Marcus said carefully, then seemed to decide something. "Actually, it was really difficult, but I didn't want to seem less committed to the job." "Marcus,
Having a personal life doesn't make you less committed. It makes you human. Victoria pressed the elevator button. If you need flexibility to help with her recovery, let me know. We can work something out. She left him staring after her with an expression of profound bewilderment as she headed to her office. The handwritten notes from yesterday were gone, presumably delivered. Victoria wondered what reactions they'd generated, whether anyone believed the shift was genuine or whether they assumed it was some new manipulation technique. Time would tell. Change wasn't about dramatic gestures. It was about small, consistent choices repeated until they became a new pattern. The board meeting at 9 a.m. proceeded with familiar efficiency, but Victoria found herself doing something new. When Richard Pembroke presented financial projections, she asked his opinion instead of just accepting the numbers. When the head of HR suggested a new employee wellness program, Victoria didn't dismiss it as soft inefficiency. She approved it immediately and asked what resources were needed to implement it well. Small changes. But the executives noticed. She could see it in their faces, the way they sat slightly less rigidly, spoke with fractionally more confidence. Fear was still present. You didn't erase 15 years of conditioning in a single meeting, but it had loosened its stranglehold just enough to let other emotions in. After the meeting, David Chen approached her hesitantly. He carried the note she'd written, the envelope slightly crumpled as if he'd read it multiple times. "Ms. Hale, I wanted to thank you for this. It means more than you probably realize." Victoria met his eyes, seeing the residual hurt from that boardroom humiliation weeks ago. "David, I owe you more than a note. The way I treated you was unprofessional and cruel. You're brilliant at what you do, and I should have said that publicly instead of tearing you down. I'm sorry." The word sorry felt foreign in her mouth, unused muscles creaking back to life. David's eyes widened. Thank you. That's very kind of you to say." "It's not kind. It's accurate and overdue." Victoria paused, then added, "Your mother came to see me. She's formidable. You're lucky to have someone who loves you that fiercely." David smiled, genuine and warm. "She's something else, isn't she? When I told her what happened, she was ready to storm your office that same day. I made her wait a week to calm down. I'm glad she didn't wait longer. I needed to hear what she had to say." Victoria gestured toward the elevator. "The server optimization project you presented. I want you to lead the implementation personally. Full authority, increased budget, and a team you choose yourself. Can you handle that?" "Absolutely. Thank you, Ms. Hale. I won't let you down." "I know you won't, because you never did in the first place. I was just too focused on finding fault to see the excellence that was right in front of me." After David left, looking slightly dazed, Marcus appeared with an unusual expression on his face. "Ms. Hale, there's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she's quite insistent. Says her name is Lily Brooks." Victoria's heart performed an unexpected flip. "Send her up." 3 minutes later, a small girl appeared in Victoria's doorway, wearing a purple backpack and an expression of determined courage. She couldn't have been more than 9, with her father's dark eyes and a gap-toothed smile that suggested she'd recently lost a front tooth. A woman in her 60s stood behind her, probably the after-school caregiver. "Hi," Lily said, with remarkable confidence for someone addressing a billionaire CEO. "I'm Lily. My dad is Ethan Brooks. He works here." "I know who your father is." "It's nice to meet you, Lily. I'm Victoria." "I know who you are, too. You're the boss of this whole building." Lily walked into the office without invitation, studying the space with open curiosity. "Dad says you're really smart and really good at business, but that you're learning how to be better at the people parts." Victoria felt her lips twitch with amusement. "That's a very diplomatic way of putting it. Your father is a wise man." "He is. That's why I wanted to talk to you." Lily set her backpack down and pulled out a slightly rumpled piece of paper. "I made you this. Dad says you've been going through something hard, and that when people are going through hard things, they need to know someone cares about them." She handed the paper to Victoria. It was a crayon drawing of a woman standing in front of a tall building, surrounded by simple stick figures of people. At the top, in careful child handwriting, it said, "It's okay to be scared. Being brave means being scared and trying anyway." Victoria stared at the drawing, feeling something crack in her chest. A 9-year-old child had somehow captured the exact truth of her current struggle in crayons and construction paper. "This is beautiful, Lily. Thank you." "You're welcome. Can I ask you something?"
Of course. Are you mean? The question was so direct, so innocent, that Victoria couldn't help but laugh, a real laugh, surprised out of her. Yes, I have been, for a very long time. Why? Because someone hurt me once, and I decided that being mean was safer than being kind. That if I was scary enough, no one could hurt me again. Lily considered this with the seriousness of someone who'd also experienced loss. When my mom died, I was really angry for a while. I was mean to my friends and to my dad. I broke stuff and yelled a lot. "I'm sorry about your mother." "Thank you, she was really nice. She used to make pancakes shaped like animals." Lily's voice wavered slightly but held steady. "Anyway, I was mean because I hurt. But then Dad told me that being mean didn't make me hurt less. It just made more people hurt. And that Mom wouldn't want me to make other people sad just because I was sad." Out of the mouths of babes, Victoria thought. A 9-year-old explaining emotional intelligence with more clarity than most business school professors. "Your dad is right, and so are you." Victoria held up the drawing. "Can I keep this?" "That's why I made it. Dad says everyone needs reminders sometimes that being scared is okay, even bosses of whole buildings." Lily's caregiver cleared her throat gently. "Sweetie, we should let Ms. Hale get back to work." "Okay, bye, Victoria." Lily grabbed her backpack and headed for the door, then paused. "Oh, one more thing. Dad's birthday is next week. We're having cake at our apartment if you want to come. It won't be fancy like you're probably used to, but Dad makes really good chocolate cake." The invitation hung in the air, innocent and sincere. Victoria's first instinct was to politely decline. She didn't attend employee social events, didn't blur professional lines, didn't engage in that kind of familiarity. But that was the old Victoria. The woman who'd been alone for 15 years and was finally admitting it wasn't working. "I'd like that very much. Thank you for inviting me." Lily beamed, gap-toothed and genuine, and then she was gone, leaving Victoria alone with a crayon drawing that somehow meant more than any of the awards and accolades lining her office walls. She pinned it to her bulletin board, right next to her Harvard MBA degree. The juxtaposition was absurd and perfect. The rest of the week proceeded with Victoria making small, deliberate changes. She ate lunch in the employee cafeteria instead of having meals delivered to her office, and discovered that people were less terrified of her when she wasn't looming in a formal office setting. She started learning names, not just executives, but assistants and maintenance staff and security guards. She asked questions and actually listened to answers. She caught herself 3 times before delivering withering criticism, choosing instead to offer constructive feedback that didn't destroy dignity in the process. It was exhausting. Unlearning 15 years of behavior patterns was harder than learning them had been, but it was also oddly liberating, like setting down a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. On Thursday afternoon, Victoria did something unprecedented. She called an all-staff meeting in the building's main auditorium, something that had never happened in the company's history. Her executive team looked nervous, uncertain what bomb she was about to drop. Employees filed in with expressions ranging from curious to terrified. Victoria stood at the podium, looking out at nearly 800 faces, and felt her heart hammering. Public speaking had never intimidated her, but public vulnerability was entirely different. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "I know this is unusual, and I know many of you are wondering what's happening. I'll be direct. Over the past few weeks, I've had some uncomfortable realizations about my leadership style and the culture I've created here. And I owe all of you an apology." The auditorium was dead silent. "For years, I've led through fear and intimidation. I've prioritized results over people, efficiency over humanity, power over connection. I told myself this was necessary for success, that tough leadership produced excellent outcomes. And by some metrics, I was right. This company is enormously successful." Victoria paused, choosing her words carefully. But success at the cost of people's dignity and well-being isn't really success. It's just expensive cruelty. She could see shock rippling through the crowd. Several executives looked like they were questioning whether Victoria had been replaced by a clone. "I can't undo years of damage in one speech."
I can't erase the times I've humiliated people in meetings, crushed spirits, created an environment where fear was the primary motivator. But I can tell you that I'm committed to doing better, to building a company where excellence and humanity coexist, where people feel valued, not just utilized, where making a mistake doesn't mean risking your career. Victoria took a breath. This will be a process. I'm going to make mistakes while I figure out how to be a different kind of leader. But I'm asking for your patience while I learn, and I'm asking you to help me. If you see me falling back into old patterns, tell me. If you have ideas for how we can improve our culture, share them. If you need support I haven't been providing, ask for it. She paused, then added the hardest part. I've been lonely at the top of this tower. I built that loneliness deliberately, thinking it was strength. But isolation isn't strength. It's just fear with a better marketing campaign. And I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of being alone. I want to build something different here, something where success and humanity aren't opposing forces. The silence that followed felt eternal. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the auditorium, someone started clapping. Slowly at first, then others joined in until the entire room was applauding. Not the polite corporate golf clap Victoria was used to, but genuine sustained applause that held surprise and relief and something that might have been hope. Victoria felt her eyes sting with tears she refused to let fall in public. She nodded her thanks and left the stage to Marcus, who'd prepared follow-up information about specific policy changes they were implementing. As she exited the auditorium, she found Ethan standing in the hallway. He'd clearly been listening from the doorway. "That was brave," he said simply. "That was terrifying," Victoria corrected. "I have no idea if anyone believed me." "Does it matter if they believe you right now? What matters is whether your actions over the next months prove it true." Ethan fell into step beside her as she walked toward the elevator. Change isn't about one grand gesture. It's about 1,000 small choices that add up to a different pattern. When did you become so wise? I'm not wise. I'm just a guy who learned some hard lessons and decided to apply them. He pressed the elevator button. Speaking of which, Lily told me she invited you to my birthday thing next week. She did. I hope that's okay. More than okay. Just warning you, it's going to be 9-year-olds running around hyped up on cake, a tiny apartment that definitely isn't penthouse level, and very casual everything. No business talk, no networking, just people celebrating another year of life. Sounds perfect, Victoria said, and meant it. The following week brought more small changes. Victoria implemented open office hours where any employee could sign up for 15 minutes of her time without going through layers of bureaucracy. She started a suggestion program where people could anonymously propose improvements without fear of retaliation. She promoted Sarah from the 71st floor to a newly created position of Employee Experience Director with full authority to reshape policies that weren't working. The building felt different. Not transformed overnight, change was slower than that. But there was a loosening of tension, a cautious optimism, as if everyone was collectively holding their breath and hoping this shift was real. On Friday evening, Victoria left work at 6 p.m. and drove to an address in Queens that her GPS assured her was correct, though it looked nothing like the neighborhood she usually inhabited. Ethan's apartment building was old but well-maintained, the kind of place where families raised kids and neighbors knew each other's names. She climbed 3 flights of stairs carrying a wrapped gift, a high-quality art supply set for Lily, since the crayon drawing was still pinned to her bulletin board, and knocked on door 3B. Ethan opened it, wearing jeans and a casual shirt that made him look younger and more relaxed than he ever did in his maintenance uniform. "Victoria, come in. Welcome to the chaos." The apartment was small but warm, filled with mismatched furniture and child artwork on every available surface. Lily's drawings covered the refrigerator like wallpaper. Photos of a beautiful woman, Rebecca, presumably, smiled from various frames, her presence still part of the home's fabric. A handful of Lily's friends were playing some elaborate game involving pillows and imagination. Several neighbors had brought food, creating a potluck spread on the kitchen counter. It was loud and crowded and completely unlike any social event Victoria had attended in years. It was also, she realized with surprise, exactly where she wanted to be. "Victoria!" Lily spotted her and ran over, dragging a friend by the hand. "This is my friend Mia. Mia, this is Victoria. She's learning how to be nicer." "Lily, Ethan said with mild exasperation, though he was smiling. What? You said that. You said she's going through a transformation. I said that privately, sweetheart. Lily looked unrepentant. Well, now it's public. Hi, Victoria. Victoria laughed, really laughed, the kind that came from her belly and felt like release. Hello, Lily. Hello, Mia. I brought you something. She handed over the art supplies, and Lily's eyes went wide. Whoa, these are fancy. Dad, look at these markers.
Those are very nice. What do you say? Thank you, Victoria. These are awesome. Lily hugged her spontaneously, a quick squeeze that Victoria wasn't prepared for but found she didn't mind at all.
The evening proceeded with the comfortable chaos of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Victoria met Ethan's neighbors, a retired teacher, a nurse who worked nights, a young couple with twins. They asked what she did, and when she explained she ran the company where Ethan worked, they responded with interest but no particular deference. To them, she was just another person at a birthday party, eating potato salad and discussing the challenges of Queen's parking. It was startlingly normal, and Victoria discovered that normal felt like coming home after a long journey. As the party wound down and parents collected their sugar-high children, Victoria found herself on the small balcony with Ethan, both of them holding beers and watching the neighborhood settle into evening. Thank you for inviting me, Victoria said. This was nice, really nice. Thanks for coming. I wasn't sure you would. Neither was I, honestly. This isn't my usual scene. What is your usual scene? Victoria thought about her empty penthouse, her solitary meals, her evenings spent working or staring at walls. Nothing, really. I don't have a scene. I have work, and then I have hours between work sessions that I fill with more work. That sounds exhausting. It is. I just didn't realize it until recently. She took a sip of beer. Can I ask you something? That drawing of Rebecca in your living room, does it hurt to see it every day? Ethan was quiet for a moment, considering. Sometimes, but mostly it reminds me that I was lucky enough to love someone worth missing. That's not a bad thing to remember. You've rebuilt a life after losing her, a good life. How did you do it? I didn't have a choice, really. Lily needed me functional, and somewhere in the process of forcing myself to be present for her, I discovered I wanted to be present for myself too, that life could still be good, just different than I'd planned. He looked at Victoria. You're rebuilding too. A different kind of rebuilding, but the principle is the same. You're letting go of who you thought you had to be and figuring out who you actually want to be. It's harder than I expected. The worthwhile things usually are. They stood in comfortable silence as the city lights began to glow against the darkening sky. Victoria felt something shift in her chest, not the dramatic transformation of movie moments, but a quiet settling, like pieces of herself she'd scattered years ago finally finding their way back home. Ethan, she said quietly, I need to tell you something. When you first challenged me in that boardroom, I hated you. I genuinely considered having you fired. I thought you were arrogant and inappropriate and completely out of line. I was out of line, Ethan agreed, but I wasn't wrong. No, you weren't, and that's what bothered me most. You saw through everything I'd built, all the power and fear and control, and you called it what it actually was. Loneliness in expensive clothes. She turned to face him. You've changed my life. In the space of a few weeks, you've made me question everything I thought I knew about leadership and success and what actually matters, and I don't know how to thank you for that. You don't need to thank me. You did the work yourself. I just asked some uncomfortable questions. You did more than that. You showed me what a life built on connection instead of fear actually looks like. You modeled a different way of being in the world, and you were patient with me while I figured out whether I was brave enough to try it myself. Ethan smiled. Are you? Brave enough? Victoria thought about the past few weeks, the apologies she'd made, the vulnerability she'd shown, the small daily choices to be human instead of powerful, the sheer terror of admitting she'd been wrong for 15 years. I'm getting there, she said. It helps having examples to follow. People who've been through hard things and came out the other side still capable of kindness. We've all got hard things in our history, Ethan said. The question is whether we let those things define us or teach us. From inside the apartment, Lily's voice called out, Dad!
Victoria, come have cake. They went inside to find a chocolate cake with slightly lopsided frosting and 38 candles, creating a minor fire hazard. Lily had clearly helped with the decorating, given the enthusiastic sprinkle distribution. It was imperfect and homemade and more beautiful than any catered dessert Victoria had ever eaten at corporate events. Everyone sang happy birthday slightly off-key. Ethan made a wish and blew out the candles. Lily demanded to know what he wished for, and he said what parents always say. Can't tell you or it won't come true. But later, as Victoria was preparing to leave, Ethan walked her to the door and said quietly, I wished for Lily to grow up in a world where people are kinder to each other than they have to be. Where success doesn't mean sacrificing humanity, where powerful people remember their people first. That's a good wish, Victoria said. I'll do my part to help make it come true. She meant it. And over the following months, she proved it. The changes at Hale Industries weren't overnight or dramatic. Victoria didn't wake up one day as a completely different person, but she made different choices day after day after day, until those choices became patterns, and those patterns became a new way of being. She implemented real work-life balance policies and enforced them even at executive levels. She created mentorship programs that paired senior leaders with junior staff. She started monthly town halls where employees could ask questions directly without fear of retaliation. She fired 2 executives who refused to adapt to the new culture, not with humiliation, but with severance packages and honest feedback about why their leadership styles no longer fit the company's values. The board was initially skeptical, but when employee retention improved dramatically, when innovation metrics went up, when the company appeared on best places to work lists for the first time in its history, they stopped questioning and started supporting. Victoria learned to say, I don't know, when she didn't know. To say I was wrong when she was wrong. To say, I need help when she needed help. Each admission felt like swallowing glass at first, but they got easier with repetition until they became almost natural. She had lunch with Marcus once a week, not to discuss work, but to actually get to know him. She discovered he was a talented amateur photographer whose work had been featured in local galleries. She'd worked beside him for 6 years and never known he had creative passions beyond task lists. She attended Lily's soccer games occasionally, standing on sidelines with other parents and cheering for kids she didn't know. It felt wonderfully ordinary, like being part of the world instead of hovering above it. She kept Lily's crayon drawing on her bulletin board as a reminder that bravery wasn't the absence of fear. It was moving forward despite it. And slowly, gradually, Victoria discovered something that shouldn't have been surprising, but somehow was. That building a life based on connection instead of control didn't make her weaker. If anything, it made her stronger. Because when crisis came, and it always came in business, she had a team that trusted her enough to follow her into uncertainty. She had people who offered honest feedback because they knew she'd listen. She had built something that could weather storms because it was founded on relationships, not just hierarchy. 6 months after that boardroom confrontation that started everything, Victoria was working late one evening when Ethan knocked on her open office door. He'd been promoted to building operations manager, a position Victoria had created specifically for him, recognizing that his talents were wasted on a mop. "Got a minute?" he asked. "For you, always. Come in." He sat in one of the chairs by her window, the same chairs where she'd had that vulnerable conversation about betrayal and loneliness months ago. "I wanted to let you know I've been offered another job, facility director for a hospital system. Significant pay increase, better benefits, career advancement." Victoria felt her stomach drop, though she kept her expression neutral. "That's wonderful, Ethan. You deserve it." "I'm not taking it." "What? Why not?" Ethan gestured around the office toward the building beyond. "Because something special is happening here. Because I believe in what we're building, not just the company, but the culture. Because watching you transform from someone who led through fear to someone who leads through trust has been one of the most inspiring things I've witnessed." He smiled. "Also, Lily's soccer team is here, and convincing a 9-year-old to change teams mid-season is harder than negotiating with billionaires." Victoria laughed, feeling relief flood through her. "I'm glad you're staying. This place is better with you in it." "It's better because you made it better. I just asked some uncomfortable questions." "You did a lot more than that, and we both know it.
Victoria stood, moving to the window. The city sparkled below, full of life and possibility. Can I ask you something? That first day in the boardroom when you interrupted my meeting, were you afraid at all? Terrified, Ethan admitted. I thought you might have me fired on the spot. But I'd watched you humiliate David Chen, and I remembered what it felt like to be broken down in front of peers. Rebecca died in part because she didn't speak up when she first noticed symptoms. She was afraid of seeming dramatic, of bothering her doctor, of making a fuss. And I promised myself after she died that I wouldn't stay silent when I saw someone being hurt, and I could do something about it, even if speaking up was scary, even if it cost me something. It could have cost you everything. Maybe, but silence has costs too, and I decided I wanted to be someone Lily could be proud of, someone who stood up for what was right, even when it was uncomfortable. Victoria turned to face him. You know what I've learned these past 6 months? That the bravest thing I ever did wasn't building $1 billion company or negotiating impossible deals or dominating my industry. It was admitting I was wrong, that I'd wasted 15 years hiding behind fear and calling it strength, that I needed to change. And look at you now, still successful, still respected, but actually connected to the humans around you. Still powerful, but wielding that power differently. I have further to go. I still catch myself falling into old patterns. I still have moments where I want to crush someone for making a mistake instead of helping them learn from it. The instinct toward cruelty isn't gone. I just get better at recognizing it and choosing something else. That's all any of us can do. Recognize our worst instincts and choose better ones. They stood together in comfortable silence, two people who'd somehow become friends despite every social and professional barrier that should have kept them distant. Victoria thought about where she'd been 6 months ago, isolated, lonely, convinced that power was enough to fill the emptiness. And she thought about where she was now, still powerful, still successful, but no longer alone. Thank you, she said quietly, for not staying silent, for challenging me, for showing me what I was missing by staying locked in my tower. Thank you for being brave enough to listen. Most people in your position would have just had me fired and never thought about it again. I almost did. You have no idea how close you came. Ethan smiled. Maybe I do, but you chose differently, and that choice changed everything. He left her office, heading home to his daughter and his modest apartment and his rich, full life. Victoria stayed a while longer, looking out at the city she'd spent 15 years conquering without ever actually being part of it. Tomorrow, she'd have a breakfast meeting with a potential mentee, a young entrepreneur who reminded her of herself before the betrayal, still idealistic and hopeful and willing to trust. Victoria was going to help her succeed without losing those qualities in the process. Next week, she'd be speaking at a conference about leadership and vulnerability, sharing her story publicly for the first time. It terrified her. She was doing it anyway. Next month, she'd be volunteering with Lily's school, helping with their career day, showing kids that success was possible without sacrificing kindness. Small things, ordinary things, things that wouldn't appear in quarterly reports or on Forbes lists, things that mattered in ways that balance sheets couldn't measure. Victoria pulled out her phone and opened her contacts. No longer hundreds of professional connections with no real friends. Now there were people she texted just to say hello, people who called to check on her when she'd had a tough day. People who'd invited her into their lives not because of what she could do for them, but because they genuinely enjoyed her company. She scrolled to a name and sent a message. Thanks for the birthday party last week. Lily is wonderful, and the cake was perfect. Same time next year? Ethan's reply came quickly. Absolutely. We'll make it a tradition. Traditions. The word felt warm, solid, real in a way that quarterly earnings and market share never had. Victoria was building traditions now, connections that would last beyond professional relationships, a life that would matter to someone beyond what she'd accomplished in business. She was building something that looked a lot like happiness. The city lights glowed beyond her window, and Victoria realized something that would have shocked the woman she'd been 6 months ago. She was exactly where she needed to be. Not in the penthouse, not at the top of the corporate ladder, not isolated in her tower of achievement. Here. Connected to people who saw her as more than a title or a bank account, vulnerable enough to be hurt, brave enough to risk it anyway, powerful enough to change lives, humble enough to admit when she needed help.
She was learning that real strength wasn't about being feared. Real strength was about being human, messy and imperfect and occasionally wrong, but trying anyway. Choosing connection over control, choosing vulnerability over invincibility, choosing to lead people towards something better instead of terrifying them into compliance. It was the hardest thing Victoria had ever done, and the most rewarding. She turned off her office light and headed for the elevator, leaving the building at 8 p.m. instead of midnight. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose humanity over fear. But tonight, she was going home to her penthouse that felt slightly less empty, to watch a movie that Lily had recommended, to call an old college friend she'd reconnected with after years of silence. Small things, human things, things that made life worth living beyond mere survival. As Victoria drove through the Manhattan evening, she thought about the janitor who'd walked into her boardroom and changed everything with his refusal to be afraid. About a 9-year-old girl who'd taught her that being brave meant being scared and trying anyway. About a woman named Rebecca, who she'd never met but whose legacy of love had survived her death through the family she'd created. And she thought about herself. Not the billionaire CEO, not the industry titan, not the woman everyone feared. Just Victoria Hale, a human being who'd gotten lost for 15 years and was finally finding her way back to herself. The journey wasn't over. Probably would never be over. Growth was continuous, not destination-based. But Victoria was traveling in the right direction now, surrounded by people who cared about her well-being instead of just her decisions. She'd spent 15 years building an empire of fear. She'd spent 6 months learning to build something better. A life based on connection, vulnerability, and the radical choice to be human in a world that often rewarded inhumanity. And as she pulled into her building's parking garage, preparing to spend an evening doing nothing productive or powerful or professionally impressive, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. She felt content, not happy in the uncomplicated way of people who'd never been hurt, but content in the deeper way of people who'd been through darkness and chosen to find light anyway. People who'd lost themselves and done the hard work of coming back. People who'd learned that power without humanity was just expensive loneliness, and that the bravest thing you could do was admit you needed people even when every instinct screamed for self-protection. The city hummed around her, full of millions of lives being lived in millions of different ways. Each one mattered. Each one was valuable. Each one contained someone just as complex and important as she was, regardless of wealth or status or accomplishments. Victoria finally understood that, finally felt it in her bones instead of just knowing it intellectually. And in that understanding, in that hard-won empathy, she found something worth more than all her billions combined. She found herself. The real version. The human version. The one who'd been buried under 15 years of armor and fear and loneliness. She found home. Not a place. A way of being in the world. Connected. Vulnerable. Brave enough to be scared and try anyway. And as she rode the elevator up to her penthouse, Victoria smiled, genuine and warm and completely unlike the sharp-edged expressions that had once passed for happiness. She was going to be okay, more than okay. She was going to be human. And that, she'd learned, was the greatest success of all.